This is the greatest survival story in history. A doomed expedition that left 28 men trapped in the frozen south of our planet. Its leader was a man named Ernest Shackleton, one of the greatest explorers of all time. The crew would battle the Antarctic winter, cross the most dangerous ocean on Earth, and attempt an impossible journey across frozen mountains, all in a desperate effort to get home alive. As a note, you can find all the books and resources used in my research in the description below. So let's begin and travel to the ends of the earth with Ernest Shackleton. Welcome to the Great Explorers. Before we go any further, it's worth saying a few words about Ernest Shackleton, as he is the main character in our story. We'll learn much more about him as events unfold, but I just want to give you enough here so you have a sense of the man. Shackleton was born in February 1874 in Caird, Ireland. When he was just 4 years old, his family relocated to London as his father pursued a career in medicine. From an early age, Ernest was drawn to books about explorers and heroes. Stories of distant places and dangerous journeys captured his imagination and planted the idea that a life of adventure was possible. A young Shackleton did not enjoy school, and at the age of 16, he was allowed to leave and take up an apprenticeship in the Merchant Navy. In essence, he became a sailor and learned the art of travelling on the high seas. This was an important life experience for the young man. He not only learned how to sail, but also how to mix with men from every social class and background. He learned how to read people and how to earn respect through hard work. Shackleton's greatest strength, without question, was his ability to lead men. We will see much more of that as we get going. But as the years went by, Shackleton grew bored with life in the Merchant Navy, just travelling from port to port. He hungered for fame and glory. He wanted to achieve something the world would remember him for. This desire for greatness would be a driving force throughout his life. Shackleton's dreams were also shaped by the world around him. At the turn of the 20th century, Britain was obsessed with exploration. African explorers like Henry Morgan Stanley and David Livingstone were celebrities and travelled the world giving lectures and selling books. For a young man, exploration was a way of acquiring fame and fortune. So it was in this context that Shackleton found his first opportunity. In 1901, while still in his 20s, he secured a place on a British expedition bound for Antarctica. At the time, the Antarctic continent was still almost completely unknown, and much of the interior had never been seen by human eyes. It was exactly the challenge he was looking for. However, a young Shackleton, full of confidence, underestimated just how difficult life in Antarctica would be. Once he arrived, he pushed himself too hard, and in the end became seriously ill. He was sent home early, which in his mind was a bitter disappointment and a failure. But if anything, it just increased his desire to return and try again. He had gotten a taste for exploration and wanted more. A few years later, Shackleton planned his return to Antarctica, this time as the leader of his own expedition. In 1907, he set out aboard a ship called the Nimrod, with the aim of becoming the first man to reach the South Pole. Shackleton and his men trekked across the Antarctic ice and came agonizingly close to the pole, closer than any human had ever reached. However, when he was just 97 miles away, the expedition was in a terrible state. Supplies were running low, and the health of his men was deteriorating rapidly. If they had pushed on, they may have reached the South Pole, but they undoubtedly would have died on the return journey. So Shackleton made the heartbreaking decision to turn back. This is one of the defining moments of his life, but also gives us great insight into his character and mind. One of Shackleton's most admirable qualities is that he did not worship success at the cost of human life. Despite being within reach of fame and glory, he chose caution over risking the lives of his men. By the way, the return journey can only be described as a race with death. The men were starving, and some were seriously ill, including Shackleton. On one occasion, Shackleton gave his daily biscuit, which was their only food, to his friend named Frank Wild, who will play a role in our upcoming story. It was such an incredibly selfless gesture that Wild wrote in his diary, quote, "I do not suppose that anyone else in the world can thoroughly realise how much sympathy was shown by this. By God, I will never forget it. Thousands of pounds would not have bought that one biscuit." End quote. And from that moment onwards, Frank Wild would be Shackleton's right-hand man for life. Anyway, in the years that followed the failed attempt, another explorer named Roald Amundsen would claim the prize of the South Pole. Amundsen, by the way, is one of the greatest explorers ever, and I will cover him at some point on this channel. But this meant that the great race that had defined Antarctic exploration was over. So at the age of 40, Shackleton found himself in a strange situation. His achievements in Antarctica were respected, but there was nothing he'd done that really made him great. He had come close to glory, but not close enough. He was frustrated, restless, and also financially insecure. On this last point, money was always a concern. He had gotten himself into debt by funding the Nimrod expedition, and felt a lot of pressure to be wealthy. His wife, a woman named Emily Dorman, came from a rich family, so Shackleton felt pressure to give her the life she was used to. As a result, he was always involved in shady money-making schemes, trying to chase his fortune. This included devising a plan to manufacture cigarettes, a fleet of taxicabs, a mining operation in Bulgaria, and a whaling factory. As you can see, he tried everything, but of course, had very little success. However, no matter how much Shackleton tried to distance himself from Antarctica, he felt himself being pulled back. The truth was, he found normal life boring and dull. In the frozen south, every moment was a physical challenge, and every decision was the difference between life and death. He wrote, quote, "I love the fight, and when things are easy, I hate it." End quote. So Shackleton came up with an idea that was new, bold, and to be honest, insanely dangerous. He would attempt to become the first human to cross the Antarctic continent from coast to coast, which was a journey of almost 2,000 miles across unexplored ice and through one of the most hostile environments on Earth. Many people thought it was an impossible challenge. But if somehow he could pull it off and survive, it would be the final great achievement of the heroic age of Antarctic exploration. So Shackleton sought out a ship that would carry him and his team to the ends of the earth. He settled on a small wooden vessel which had been constructed at a famous Norway shipyard that had built some of the greatest polar ships in the world. She was 144 feet long, built from solid oak and Norwegian fir, and designed for strength over speed. Her hull was designed to withstand the immense forces of Antarctic ice. Shackleton named her the Endurance after his family motto, "By endurance we conquer." By the way, securing funding for the expedition was a constant worry. Shackleton managed to get some money from the British government and a few wealthy individual sponsors, but not nearly enough to cover all the costs. But just when he thought he might have to cancel the whole venture, an extremely wealthy Scottish businessman named James Caird, who was a billionaire at the time, donated £24,000 with no strings attached. We don't really know what drove Caird to support Shackleton, as he hadn't expressed much support for polar exploration before, but what matters is that he did, and the expedition was a go. So now with a ship, Shackleton needed to find a crew. The story goes that he placed an ad in a London newspaper that said, quote, "Men wanted for hazardous journey, low wages, bitter cold, long hours of complete darkness, safe return doubtful, honour and recognition in event of success." End quote. Now, we don't know if that's true, but it is a fun story, and in any event, word spread quickly of the new expedition, and 5,000 people would apply to participate. This included, in Shackleton's words, quote, 3 sporty girls, end quote. He politely declined the young women and went about putting together his team. In total, there would be 28 men aboard the Endurance, but there are 4 men that will be absolutely instrumental to the survival of everyone, and so I want to highlight them quickly. First, there is the man who will captain the Endurance, a New Zealander named Frank Worsley. Worsley was a master navigator and in many ways the brains of the expedition. He was good-spirited and talkative, if a little lax when it came to disciplining the men. His skills of navigating ships in harsh conditions were second to none, and would prove invaluable. Next, there was Frank Wild, who was second in command. As I mentioned earlier, Wild had been with Shackleton on the Nimrod expedition, and the two had a very close bond. To put it simply, Wild was Shackleton's right-hand man. They trusted each other above all else. Then there was the second officer, an Irishman called Tom Crean. To be honest, Crean is probably my favourite member of the expedition, as the man can be best described as an absolute machine. He was physically the most capable man on board and as tough as they come. No matter how bad the conditions, Tom Crean did not complain and was known for having a smile on his face when all others had given up hope. He will be indispensable for the expedition as we move on. And lastly, that brings me to a man named Frank Hurley. I mention Hurley because he was the expedition's photographer, and many of the images you will see throughout this video were shot by Hurley. I think it's amazing we have these photos and the fact they survived the ordeal that is to come. One last thing I want to mention about the preparation is the purchase of 69 Canadian sledge dogs. Roald Amundsen, the explorer I mentioned earlier, had used dogs when he successfully reached the South Pole, and Shackleton believed they were the ticket to success. The dogs were to be shipped to Buenos Aires, where the Endurance would pick them up. So by the summer of 1914, the ship and the team were ready. In August, the Endurance left London and headed south. As a side note here, Shackleton actually stayed behind in England after the Endurance departed in order to raise last-minute funds. He would meet up with the team later in Buenos Aires. I mention this because it was at this moment that the first shots of the First World War were being fired in Europe. Shackleton was hesitant to abandon his nation at this time of conflict, and so sent a telegram to the King of England asking if he should cancel the expedition and help in the upcoming struggle. However, the King replied, through the Admiralty, that Shackleton should proceed. He thought that Shackleton's expedition would be symbolically meaningful for Britain and help boost the nation's morale. So when Shackleton finally reunited with the Endurance in Buenos Aires, the team's final preparations were underway, but he was disappointed to find the expedition in a chaotic state. The ship was in poor order and the discipline of the men had slipped. Shackleton quickly imposed control by firing 3 sailors and a cook. Replacements were found, but from that moment, the men came to understand why Shackleton was known as the boss. He expected his orders to be followed. As a note, throughout this video, I will sometimes refer to Shackleton as the boss, so don't get confused. Before we set off, I will just make a note of Shackleton's health, which to be honest was not great. He was worn down, tired, and suffered from chest pain and shortness of breath. The cause of this was likely stress, anxiety, and to be honest, just years of physical strain. It is widely believed that Shackleton suffered from some kind of heart condition. Throughout his career, he had gone to great lengths to avoid being examined by doctors. It was as if he knew there was something wrong with him, and he was scared the doctors would advise him to live a quiet life instead. Just know that Shackleton's health, at times, will cause him difficulty. Finally, on October 26, 1914, the Endurance set course for Antarctica. The expedition was officially underway. Something you should know is that a few days after leaving Buenos Aires, a stowaway was discovered on board. The man in question was a 19-year-old named Percy Blackborough. He had tried to join the expedition, but had been turned down, and so had hidden below deck. When discovered, he was brought before Shackleton, who flew into a rage, as this would mean another mouth to feed. However, the boss was impressed with the young man's spirit and hired him, although to be honest, it was too late to turn back around and drop him off anyway. Shackleton did joke, however, that, quote, "If we run out of food and anyone has to be eaten, you will be first," end quote. The crew quickly learned how Shackleton liked to operate. The boss did not believe in class, rank, or favoritism. Every man was expected to work. This rankled some of the scientists on board, as they were expected to carry out the same duties as the sailors. One man, named Thomas Ord-Lees, who came from an upper-class background, complained in his diary that, quote, "I find we have got to work. Rope pulling makes the hands dirty and tarry, but it is good exercise, I suppose," end quote. 11 days after setting out, the men reached a remote island called South Georgia. South Georgia Island will play an important role in our story, so I'll give you some quick background on the place. Lying around 875 miles north of Antarctica, the island can be best described as bleak, harsh, and inhospitable. It is extremely mountainous, with some peaks reaching over 10,000 feet high, and their slopes locked in snow and ice. Although officially a British territory, the island was uninhabited apart from a few Norwegian whaling stations. In Shackleton's time, almost half of the island's interior was unmapped, as it was simply so desolate there was no reason to explore. South Georgia Island was first discovered in 1773 by James Cook, when he became the first known person to cross the Antarctic Circle. Cook did not value the island at all, describing it in his diary as, quote, "a savage and horrible country, not a tree to be seen, nor a shrub even big enough to make a toothpick. I make bold that the world will make no benefit from it," end quote. But in the years that followed, men did find a use for the place. The surrounding area was abundant with whales and seals, and so that meant money. Small whaling stations were set up along the coast, and it was to one of these bleak outposts that the Endurance now arrived. For Shackleton and his men, South Georgia represented the last outpost of humanity, a final chance to resupply with coal, clothing, and food. Beyond this point, there would be no help at all. Shackleton was keen to speak with the whalers on the island, as they would share precious information about the condition of the ice closer to Antarctica. And well, the news was not good. The Norwegians warned him that the ice was already forming to the south, a dangerous sign this early in the season. And just to be clear, summer in Antarctica runs roughly from October to March. When I say summer, I mean slightly milder temperatures and marginally less ice, though conditions can vary wildly from year to year. So the fact that Shackleton's summer should have been beginning, and yet the ice was already thickening, was a serious problem. Many of the whalers advised the expedition that they should wait for the next season to try, but Shackleton ignored them. With the war raging in Europe and financial concerns always weighing heavy, he felt that if he postponed the expedition, it may never get going at all. So on December 5th, 1914, the Endurance left South Georgia Island and began her journey towards Antarctica. Just 2 days later, the expedition began to encounter their first ice floes. These floes could be 150 square miles and were enormous. If you don't know what an ice floe is, it's basically a large flat sheet of ice, kind of what you would imagine an iceberg to be. The crew were amazed at the sheer scale of it, if not more than a little concerned. The warnings of the Norwegians had come true. Shackleton wrote in his diary, quote, "I had not expected to find pack ice nearly so far north," end quote. However, the boss was pleased at how well the Endurance battered her way through the ice. I forgot to mention earlier, but the Endurance was steam-powered as well as sail, which is how she could carve a path through this frozen wasteland. The ship's supply of coal, therefore, which was the fuel that powered her boilers, was very important. Shackleton's main concern at this point was speed. They were travelling far slower than expected. In open water, the Endurance could cover nearly 200 miles in a single day, but in the ice she was crawling, often averaging little more than 30. At this pace, it could take 2 to 3 months just to reach the Antarctic coast, and by then, the brief summer window would already be closing. It meant that the Endurance would risk being trapped in the ice, unable to get back out. On Christmas Day, 1914, the men would celebrate by treating themselves to a large dinner. There was turtle soup, fish, pudding, mince pies, and of course lots of rum. There was singing and music. Shackleton understood how important it was to keep morale high amongst the men. In fact, he spent a lot of time and effort ensuring there was adequate entertainment on board, such as music, poetry recitments, and games. It was likely the men were going to spend months in the cold confines of the ship, often in constant darkness. Shackleton had witnessed before how Antarctica could break a man's spirit over time. He wanted to do everything he could to keep the men motivated. However, while the men enjoyed themselves, Shackleton was quietly concerned about how much coal the Endurance was using up. There had been far more ice than anticipated, and the boilers were fired up all day long. If this continued, they would risk running out of fuel, and the ship would be dead in the ice. By the way, Shackleton's plan was to travel down the east side of the infamous Weddell Sea, sticking to the coast of the continent. If you don't know, the Weddell Sea is a vast bay on the east side of Antarctica, filled with ice. It is over 1,000 miles wide and is incredibly dangerous. The historian Thomas Henry described it by saying, quote, "The Weddell Sea is, according to the testimony of all who have sailed through it, the most dismal and treacherous region on earth." End quote. If all went well, eventually they would reach a small opening in the Antarctic coast known as Vassal Bay, which had been discovered by a German explorer a few years earlier. From there, the crew would unload the supplies, dogs and sledges, while Shackleton and 5 other men would prepare for the overland march across the continent. It was, as I said before, a pretty insane plan. Anyways, 5 days after Christmas, the expedition crossed the Antarctic Circle. The day after, the ice thickened out of nowhere, and the Endurance narrowly avoided getting stuck. It was an alarming moment for the men. Shackleton had never seen the ice so thick at this time of year. He had expected to be able to travel freely through the Weddell Sea for weeks, and yet already they were struggling. It was not a good sign. On January 6th, the ice was thick enough so that the men could let the dogs onto the pack in order to give them exercise. It was the first time they had been off the ship since leaving South Georgia Island a month ago. This is a picture from that moment. By the way, I think it's easy to imagine the ice fields as being flat and snowy, but as you can see here, the ice pack was often chaotic and jagged, with chunks of ice the size of boulders strewn around the surface. It's also important to note that the ice was never still and moved with the wind and currents. One minute there could be an opening, but the next it would have closed. It was like trying to navigate a maze that continually rearranged itself. It was around this time that Shackleton made a big decision. He would allow Endurance to get iced in for the winter. There were a few reasons for this. The original plan had been for Endurance to drop Shackleton and 5 other men at Vassal Bay along with the supplies for their trek, before sailing back to Buenos Aires. But with the ice already so thick, and coal running low, Shackleton just didn't think the Endurance would make it back out. If they waited until the following summer, at least the ice would be less dense. Now, being iced in had always been a possibility. The ship was well provisioned, and the men would be able to hunt fresh game such as seals and penguins. They would just have to wait out the cold, dark winter. On January 15th, the Endurance came upon a sheltered bay dominated by a vast glacier and towering ice cliffs. Shackleton named it Glacier Bay. It lay roughly 200 miles north of their intended destination, Vassal Bay. It was, by any measure, a good place to stop. The bay was sheltered and the ice here was relatively stable. It would have been a safe place to wait out the winter. The trouble was, staying would come at a cost. If they stopped here, the overland journey would be extended by another 200 miles, which was a significant addition to an already extreme trek. In the end, Shackleton chose to press on. He wanted to get further south while he still could. It is a decision he will come to regret. On January 19th, the ship would get trapped in the ice. They would be stuck for over a week, until on the 24th, an opening appeared 100 yards from the ship. This was their chance. Shackleton ordered the boilers to be fired and sails raised, but the ice was just too solid. The crew took to chisels and crowbars, desperately trying to hack a path to freedom, but had no success. Over the following weeks, all the men could do was wait. With the ship stuck, boredom inevitably set in. The men played football on the ice and looked after the dogs to pass the time. While wintering on the ice had always been a possibility, many men were frustrated now they were faced with the reality. Several times openings would be spotted in the ice and an attempt would be made to free Endurance, but to no avail. On February 22nd, the drift would carry Endurance to the 77th parallel, which would be the furthest south she would ever reach. Shackleton later wrote, quote, "The summer had gone. Indeed, the summer had scarcely been with us at all. The seals were disappearing and the birds were leaving us. The land was still in fair weather on the horizon, but it was beyond our reach now." End quote. I like that quote as it really gives you a sense of the impending isolation the men felt as winter kicked in and the wildlife left. On February 24th, Shackleton gathered the men. He announced that their hopes of freeing themselves were over. The Endurance was to become their winter station for at least the next 7 to 8 months. The Endurance had gone as far as she could. While Shackleton must have been disappointed internally, after all, he was 40 years old, and this expedition was likely his last shot at conquering Antarctica. He did not voice his frustrations to the men. Alexander Macklin, one of the ship's surgeons, wrote, quote, "Shackleton at this time showed one of his sparks of greatness. He did not rage at all, or show outwardly any sign of disappointment. He told us simply and calmly we must winter in the pack, explained its dangers, never lost his optimism, and prepared for winter." End quote. Now they were stuck, Shackleton was keen to use their time wisely. One of the first tasks he set for the men was to build shelters on the ice. Endurance's boilers were switched off to conserve coal, and as a result, the ship was bitterly cold. The tents and ice huts gave the men much more room, and the dogs were infinitely happier to be off the ship. Speaking of dogs, they would be one of the primary sources of amusement for the men, and they spent hours exercising and playing with them. In April, Shackleton divided the 50 dogs into 6 teams of men. Each team was responsible for the health of their dogs, which was paramount as 15 had already died from worms. The teams were encouraged to race each other on the sledges in friendly competition and to scout around the ice for seals and penguins. But let's not forget that sledge dogs are not normal pets. They are often vicious and ill-tempered. They would regularly fight and sometimes even kill each other. The men had their work cut out looking after them. There were, however, a couple of litters of pups born, and they would become beloved by the crew. This is a famous photo of Tom Crean holding the pups. One of the most important tasks for the men was to hunt seals and penguins in order to build up a supply of meat and blubber. The meat would be needed to feed the men and the dogs, and blubber could be used as a fuel in stoves and lamps. By April 10th, they had accumulated over 5,000 pounds of meat and blubber. Shackleton estimated this would last them around 90 days, so that they could avoid dipping into their rations for a few months. It was a good thing they did this early, because as winter set in, many of the animals would migrate further north, and sightings would reduce dramatically. So during this time, Shackleton and the men believed they just had to wait out the winter. They did not think they were doomed. The priority was to make sure all the men remained optimistic. Everyone was expected to carry out duties on the ship, including cooking and cleaning. And I mean everyone. Even Shackleton took his turn. As I mentioned before, Shackleton believed every man needed to do his part and contribute effort to the wider team, no matter their rank. It is one of the reasons the men respected and loved him as a leader. No matter what job needed to be done, Shackleton was there and willing. On the 1st of May, the sun disappeared entirely and would not be seen again for the next 4 months. Electric lights were hung around the ship, so the men were not in complete darkness. It's worth knowing that despite the boredom, there were moments of intense beauty. The sight of the moon and stars above the frozen sea in the silent darkness was a thing to behold. These moments helped to remind the crew of why they had signed up in the first place. Now, entertainment was so crucial that it had been a priority when hiring members of the crew. One man recalled that in his interview with Shackleton, the boss hadn't asked him whether he could sail or had polar experience. Instead, he simply asked if he could sing. As to Shackleton, that was just as important. There was a gramophone for music, and the men organised plays and skits. The boss also made it a point to be around the men as much as possible. He wanted to know what they were thinking and feeling. That way, if he detected any signs of despair or despondency, he would be quick to snuff it out. One of the values that Shackleton most projected was optimism, which he described as, quote, true moral courage, end quote. Pessimists were treated with contempt. Thomas Ord-Lees, who was probably the most disliked member of the expedition on account of his snobbiness, often rubbed Shackleton the wrong way. However, what's interesting is that the boss wouldn't hold a grudge. One day, Ord-Lees had hurt his back shoveling snow and was uncomfortable laying in his bunk. Without hesitation, Shackleton invited him into his own cabin and looked after him, all for a man he rather disliked. Shackleton also placed a lot of trust in his lieutenants, such as Frank Wild and Tom Crean, in order to keep the men in line. These were hard, smart, and fair men who would back the boss to the end. Now, there was one member of the crew in particular who caused issues. His name was Harry McNish, the carpenter of the expedition. McNish was big, strong, and was not afraid of an argument. Shackleton knew he would have to keep an eye on him. As a quick note, this is the only existing photo I could find of McNish, and there appears to be some doubt as to whether this is him at all. As it isn't a great picture and the identity is questionable, I will only use it when I absolutely have to. So over the next few weeks and months, the men tried to keep their spirits high, although every now and then the ship would creak and groan, bringing the men back to the reality of the situation. It got colder as well. In June, the average temperature was minus 27 Celsius or negative 16 Fahrenheit, and the men struggled to stay warm. As time went by, Shackleton began to grow concerned about the Endurance. The ice was thickening around the sides of the ship, and there was enormous pressure being placed on the hull. The groaning and creaking sounds were becoming more frequent. While the Endurance was considered to be one of the strongest ships ever built, she had been designed to plough through the ice, not get frozen in it. This meant the pressure of the ice had nowhere to go but inwards. By the end of June, the ship had drifted more than 670 miles since she had been frozen. Each mile was bringing her closer to open water, and the men felt cautiously hopeful. The hours of daylight were increasing, and they felt as if they would soon be free. However, on July 13th, a blizzard struck. The wind was ferocious, and Shackleton was now deeply worried about the Endurance. He called Wild and Worsley into his cabin and shared for the first time the possibility that the ship might not make it. She was shaking and trembling. Frank Worsley, the captain, wrote, quote, "I couldn't help thinking that it was making the sort of sound that you would expect a human being to utter if he were in fear of being murdered." End quote. Worsley, by the way, was devastated to hear Shackleton say this, one because he was an optimist, but also because he feared to lose the ship, which was the worst fate for a skipper. Wisely, Shackleton instructed the men to keep the discussion to themselves, as he didn't want panic to spread among the crew. He did, however, order everyone to try and clear the ice and snow around the ship to help alleviate the pressure. And so began a slow, anxious period where the men feared for the ship. Shackleton, Worsley and Wild took a 4-hour watch every night, as they didn't want to be caught off guard if anything catastrophic happened. Shackleton was only sleeping around 3 hours a day. Through August, there would be moments of panic as the pressure mounted and storms blew in, but there were no major incidents. On the 27th, Hurley took these haunting photos of the Endurance at night, which you can see here. I think you can get a sense of the isolation the men must have been feeling from these images. Just 2 days later, on the 29th, the crew were asleep when a single heavy shock rocked the ship. The men sat up in their bunks and waited for something terrible to happen, but it never came. The next morning, they noticed a thin crack running along the rear of the ship. A few hours later, another shock wave hit, and the men were horrified to notice the crack had widened over an inch. Throughout September, the men clung to the hope that the ship would break free. Spring was coming, which helped to lift their spirits. The sun now shone for 10 hours a day, and on September 10th, the men recorded a temperature of 1.9 degrees Celsius above zero, which is 35 degrees Fahrenheit, which to them felt like a summer's day. Life also began to return around them. Sea leopards and seals appeared in the water. Killer whales were sighted offshore. Penguins gathered once more on the ice. It was a sign that the worst of winter had passed. At least they would be able to hunt moving forward. On October 10th, the temperature rose, and the ice floe that had been pressing against the ship's starboard side finally broke free, leaving Endurance floating in a small pool of open water. It was the first time in 9 months that the ship had been afloat. Shackleton ordered the boilers fired and sails raised, but a serious leak was discovered, delaying the attempt. By the time it had been repaired, the pack had frozen once again, and the opening was gone. Then finally, on October 18th, the ice floes pressed against the hull and would not stop. The Endurance began to tip over. In just a few seconds, the ship rolled over 20 degrees to the port side. Everything that was not tied down spilled across the ship. The dogs were flung across the deck, howling and whining in confusion. Some of the men ready to jump off in an effort to save themselves. Now eventually the confusion and chaos subsided, and that evening the floes drifted apart, allowing the Endurance to right itself. But there was now no denying that the ship was in serious danger. A few days went by, but then on October 24th, the pressure began again, and this time would not stop. It was the worst the men had felt. They could actually see the ice pack buckling and changing shape as the pressure moved towards the ship. Alexander Macklin, one of the surgeons, watched it approach them from the deck for a few seconds and wrote, quote, "The whole sensation was of something colossal, of something in nature too big to grasp." End quote. Those words paint a terrifying image. Moments later, the ship's timbers began to fail. The walls caved inward under the force of the ice, and water started pouring into the hull. Shackleton immediately ordered the engine pumps to be manned, but they struggled against the sheer volume of water pouring in. The men worked in shifts through the night, pumping relentlessly. Others hacked trenches in the ice outside the ship in a desperate attempt to relieve pressure, but it made no difference. The carpenter, Harry McNish, worked for hours in waist-deep icy water to try and contain the leak. But at the same time, reality was setting in. Men began gathering what supplies they could: food, equipment, anything that might be needed when they would be forced to abandon ship. Frank Worsley tore through the ship's library, ripping out pages that contained maps of the surrounding seas and coastline, anything that might prove useful in the days to come. Meanwhile, all around them, the Endurance cried out as the ice continued its slow, unstoppable work. That evening, something strange happened. Amid the chaos of trying to save the ship, the men noticed 10 emperor penguins standing silently on the ice, facing Endurance. They had never seen so many together in one place, and for a time the creatures simply watched. But then one by one, they tilted their heads back and let out a long, mournful cry. It was deeply unsettling. Frank Worsley, the captain who witnessed this, later wrote, quote, "I have never, either before or since, heard them make any sound similar to the sinister wailings they moaned that day." End quote. Again, I think that's just such a haunting image. For 3 days, the men fought to save the ship. They worked the pumps in 15-minute shifts, barely sleeping. The carpenter, McNish, finally finished his work after 28 hours of constant labour, but it only slowed the flow of water, not stopped it. There was now no denying it. The Endurance was doomed. At last, Shackleton gave the order to abandon ship. Supplies were lowered onto the ice. The 3 lifeboats were hauled down and made ready. One by one, the dogs were evacuated down canvas chutes over the ship's side, kind of like the slides fitted to modern aeroplanes today. It was not long before the ship's deck tore open and the beams broke. As the water surged into the hold of Endurance, it froze, adding to the weight of the ice, pulling her down into the depths. Shackleton was the last to leave the ship. All throughout the chaos he had been calm and focused. Thomas Ord-Lees, the quartermaster, noted, quote, "For most of the time he stood on the upper deck, holding onto the rigging, smoking a cigarette with a serious but unconquered air." End quote. By 7 p.m. on October 27th, all essential gear had been transferred to the ice, and a small camp had been established 100 yards from the sinking ship. To be honest, the men were thankful the fight was over. They were simply too exhausted to care. Everyone was glad to be off the ship, although Alexander Macklin and Frank Wild went back to the Endurance to retrieve some lumber. As they crawled through the interior of the ship, they could hear and feel it breaking up around them. Macklin would later describe the experience, writing, quote, I do not think I have ever had such a horrifying, sickening sensation of fear as I had whilst in the hold of that breaking ship." End quote. That really gives you a sense of how terrifying an experience that must have been. Anyway, in their makeshift camp, the men were issued a sleeping bag and assigned to a tent. Something I just wanted to add here as a side note is that there were two types of sleeping bags. One type was made out of animal furs, and the other was just simple wool. The fur bags were by far the more desirable, but there were only 18 of them, and so the men decided to draw lots. Well, as chance would have it, nearly all the lower ranked men drew the better bags. A sailor named Blakewell wrote, quote, "There was some crooked work in the drawing. Sir Ernest, Mr. Wild, Worsley, and some of the other officers all drew wool bags. The fine fur bags all went to the men under them." End quote. I mention this because it's another example of Shackleton's selflessness and care for his men. He rigged the drawing so that he and the more experienced men would fare worse. That first night on the ice, the temperature dropped to -15 Celsius or 5 Fahrenheit. The ground sheets in the tents were not waterproof, and the linen sides were so thin you could see the moon through them. The men shuffled up to each other for warmth. It's hard to imagine the level of discomfort and just how ill-equipped they were by modern standards. Shackleton didn't even try to sleep. He paced up and down the camp, deep in thought. At about 1 a.m, the ice shook under them, and he noticed a crack appear alongside the tents. He quickly woke the men, and they transferred everything, supplies, sleds, dogs, and tents, to a more stable part of the ice. This would occur another 2 times throughout that first night, and nobody got much sleep. But eventually, morning came. The men awoke, stiff and cold to their bones. Warm milk was prepared for breakfast, and then Shackleton gathered the expedition. He spoke calmly and without emotion, saying, quote, "The ship is gone, so now we'll go home." End quote. It was an understated and optimistic message. He then relayed their next move. The plan was to march north towards Paulet Island. Paulet Island was the nearest known place where they might find food and shelter. It is a small island, less than 1.5 miles in diameter. 12 years before, the crew of a Swedish ship had spent the winter there after their ship had also been crushed in the Weddell Sea. The rescue ship that had finally found them left stores of supplies on the island in case of any future castaways. Shackleton knew this, and he was sure the island was their best chance. But reaching it would not be easy. The island lay 346 miles away, across a constantly shifting ice pack. To reach it, the men would have to drag all of their supplies by hand and haul the 2 remaining lifeboats with them, in case they encountered open water along the way. And let's not forget, the ice pack wasn't just a flat field. There were ridges and boulders and walls of ice sometimes 50 feet high. It was an enormous obstacle course, and every mile would be a struggle. Also, the ice they were standing on was drifting roughly in the right direction for now, northwest, but that could change in a flash, and if it broke up around them, well then, their only hope would be the lifeboats. The basic idea was that if they reached the island, they would then eventually be able to signal to the whaling ships that visited the area. It was a small hope, but it was the best they had. And despite the challenge ahead, the men took the briefing in their stride. They had discussed what would come next for months if the boat had sank, and knew this was their best hope. Also, after months of waiting, they were glad to actually have a plan and be able to take action. Privately, Shackleton was terrified of anything happening to the men. That evening, he wrote in his diary, quote, "I pray God I can manage to get the whole party safe to civilization." End quote. So over the next 2 days, the men got to work, sorting through what remained of the ship's supplies. Anything that could not be carried would be left behind. The carpenter, Harry McNish, built makeshift sledges for 2 of the lifeboats so they could be hauled across the ice. They would weigh more than half a ton each, and as a result, it was decided they would leave the 3rd lifeboat at the wreck of Endurance for now. For the march, Shackleton laid down strict limits. Each man was permitted only the clothes he wore, 2 pairs of mittens, 6 pairs of socks, 2 pairs of boots, a sleeping bag, a pound of tobacco, and no more than 2 pounds of personal belongings. To underline this last point, Shackleton took out his gold cigarette case and several gold coins and tossed them onto the snow. Anything that wasn't essential was to be left behind. Shackleton had learned on earlier expeditions that in situations like this, speed mattered more than anything else. By afternoon, a strange pile had formed on the ice. Axes, chronometers, telescopes, books, and photographs, the visible remains of their former lives. There were a few exceptions. The 2 doctors were allowed to keep their medical supplies, and men with diaries were permitted to retain them. And a man named Leonard Hussey, who was the expedition's meteorologist, was allowed to keep his banjo, which Shackleton described as, quote, vital mental tonic, end quote. But there were still more sacrifices to be made. Shackleton ordered 3 of the puppies to be shot, along with Alexander Macklin's pet dog, Sirius, who refused to wear a harness. Tom Crean, ever stoic, carried out the task of killing the puppies. Macklin led his own dog away, and after hesitation, did what was required. It took 2 shots, because he was shaking so much, he missed the first. Now this sounds brutal, and it was, but there was an important reason. The animals would only be taking up food needed by the men. Everyone or everything that ate precious food needed to work for it. As you can imagine, the killings cast a shadow over the entire camp. The puppies had been loved by everyone, and some men cursed Shackleton for the decision. The next day, October 30th, the men woke up ready to march. Shackleton led a small scouting party ahead of the main group so they could clear any obstacles. The remaining men and 49 dogs set off just after. They hauled the sledges, which contained all the expedition's food and supplies, some of them weighing an insane 900 pounds each. And don't forget the 2 lifeboats, which were even heavier. Very quickly, the men realised the difficulty of what they were attempting. The sledges sank into the soft snow, so it was more like ploughing through it. At times, the men sank up to their waist in the cold slush. And don't forget the mounds and ridges. Every 100 yards, the expedition was forced to carve their way through a chunk of ice, sawing and hacking. After a day of back-breaking work, they had travelled only 1 mile. They had 340 miles to go and only 2 to 3 months of food. At this rate, they would never make it. The next morning, they set off again, but it was tortuously slow going. Shackleton and Wild went ahead to look for a suitable route, but all they could see to the horizon was a jagged mess of ice. Shackleton was forced to make a decision. He gathered the men and told them that marching across the ice would be impossible. Instead, they should set up a more permanent camp and wait for the ice to break up around them. When it did, they would then take to the lifeboats and try and make it to Paulet Island. Now, this new camp would be named Ocean Camp, and here is a picture of it. The long canvas structure you can see here at the back was known as the galley. It was a communal kitchen where the men gathered to eat. It was built from Endurance's sails and whatever timber could be salvaged from the wreck. Shackleton was determined that the men should have a shared space, somewhere they could come together, rather than sitting alone in their tents, brooding on the situation. For now, their plan was simple, just wait for the ice to break up. But because all they could do was wait, morale mattered more than ever. Since they were only 2 miles away from the Endurance, men were sent back to retrieve any supplies they had been forced to leave behind. This included the third of Endurance's lifeboats, which will be very valuable in the future. The men also found some other useful objects in the wreck. They pulled nails from the planks and brought back wood that could be used for crafting sledges or repairing the boats. A cheer went up when someone spotted containers of sugar and flour floating in the wreck, which were quickly recovered. And Frank Hurley, the photographer, made one final dangerous decision of his own. He returned to the ship to try and retrieve his glass photographic plates. To reach them, he had to hack a hole through the ice and even dive into the freezing water. Now remember that Shackleton only wanted each man to carry 2 pounds of gear, but he did make an exception for the photographs. In the back of his mind, he seemed to know that if they survived this, These photos would be important. I find it amazing that Hurley managed to save them at all, and that's why we can see these images right here today. It's just incredible. So Shackleton's biggest enemy at this time was idleness. He wanted everyone to keep busy. The men cared for the dogs, went on hunting parties, and scouted the ice. Lookouts were also posted throughout the night, so they could watch for cracks or sudden movements in the pack, which could happen at any time. These routines helped give structure to the days, and survival now depended not just on the endurance of the body, but endurance of the mind. In terms of entertainment, Leonard Hussey continued to play his banjo, and Shackleton hosted poker games in his tent. What surprised the men most was how quickly they adapted to this new life. Frank Worsley reflected on this in his diary, writing, quote, "The rapidity with which one can completely change one's ideas and accommodate ourselves to a state of barbarism is wonderful." End quote. At this stage, it's important to understand that the men were still optimistic they would get home, and in large part, that belief came from Shackleton himself. However, privately, the boss was terrified. His expedition was in ruins. Years of planning, fundraising, and ambition had been wiped away with the loss of the ship. But he refused to dwell on it. His focus narrowed to a single purpose: keep every man alive and bring them home. So with morale always in mind, Shackleton took deliberate steps to manage the group. He carefully assigned men to specific tents, ensuring that each one contained a balance of optimistic and pessimistic personalities, so that no one could spiral unchecked. The more troublesome men were placed in Shackleton's own tent, where he could keep a close eye on them. One of these was Frank Hurley, the photographer, who was a strong-willed character and also possessed a bit of an ego. Shackleton made sure to consult with him in regards to important decisions, not because he particularly needed his input, but because it made Hurley feel valued and involved. The men talked endlessly to pass the time. They speculated about the war in Europe. They had now been away from the outside world for over a year, so they had no news and no comprehension of what was taking place on the other side of the world. But one subject dominated all others: food. Worsley wrote, quote, "All we seem to live for and think of now is food. I have never in my life taken half such a keen interest in food as I do now. We are ready to eat anything." End quote. This is a common phenomenon among people deprived of food. The men fantasized and even dreamed of it, and naturally, the remaining food stores became a point of intense focus. Shackleton met with Wild, Worsley, and Hurley to assess the situation. They had around 4.5 tons of food stored, some salvaged from the ship, some from hunted seals and penguins. At full rations, it was estimated their food would last around 3 months. That would carry them into January, the height of the Antarctic summer. By then, Shackleton knew a decision would need to be made before winter crept back in. The trouble was that everything now depended on the drift of the ice pack. Let's remember, these men were not anchored to anything solid. They were living on a vast, floating sheet of ice, carried wherever the currents of the Weddell Sea decided to take them. Their hope was that the pack would continue to drift northwest towards Paulet Island, but there were no guarantees. If the drift slowed, or worse, stopped altogether, they would face an impossible choice. Either they would attempt to survive an Antarctic winter on the ice pack itself, or they would be forced into a desperate dash for safety in the lifeboats, regardless of conditions. No one wanted to contemplate wintering on the ice. The cold would be merciless, storms would batter the pack without warning, and the ice could fracture beneath them at any moment. With no shelter, no ship, and dwindling supplies, their chances of survival would be close to zero. But for now, all they could do was wait and see where the ice carried them. Now, one point I will mention in regards to the men is to do with their appearance. On the Endurance, the men had regularly shaved and cut their hair. However, the scissors, razors, and soap had gone down with the ship, and so the men were growing thick beards and long hair. Also, each tent was fitted with a stove for cooking and warmth, and the seal blubber that was used as the fuel gave off a greasy black soot. Many of the men's faces turned black due to this. Some would wash themselves in the snow, but others thought it gave them protection from the cold. Whatever the case, their appearances were starting to change, and they looked like the castaways they were. By mid-November, the weather took an unexpected turn. Temperatures rose to -6°C or 20 Fahrenheit. After months of bitter cold, the men initially welcomed the warmth, but it quickly became clear that it would bring new problems of its own. Ocean Camp turned into a slushy mess. As the ice softened and melted, pools of water spread everywhere, soaking everyone and everything. The men built makeshift wooden floors inside the tents, but even these didn't stop their sleeping bags from sinking into the ice. It was cold, wet, and miserable. To keep warm, the men lay packed head to toe like sardines. If one man shifted in the night, another was almost guaranteed to get wet. It was a difficult environment, and as you can imagine, tensions began to flare. There was only one consolation the men could cling to. It meant the ice pack was melting, and if it broke up completely, it would finally allow them to take to the boats. On the evening of November 21st, as the men chatted in their tents, they suddenly heard Shackleton shout, "She's going, boys!" They rushed to the lookout platform, where they saw the last of Endurance sinking into the ice. William Blakewell, a seasoned sailor, summed up the moment by writing, quote, "There was a silence over the camp. As for me, there was an odd lump in my throat, and I found it hard to swallow. We were now very lonely," end quote. In his diary, Shackleton merely mentioned the Endurance was gone and followed up by saying, "I cannot write about it." The final loss of Endurance was a significant psychological moment for the men. The ship had been their last remaining tie with civilization, and now it was gone. Everyone felt a little more lonely after her passing. And so November drew to a close. The men had been on the ice for over a month, and while dealing with the discomfort, they were relatively okay. However, December would prove to be much more difficult, especially for Shackleton. The boss came down with an attack of sciatica, which is severe back pain, and for a few days he was unable to leave his sleeping bag. He resented being away from the men and not being able to keep a close eye on them. This period made him anxious and restless, but despite his troubles, he refused any special treatment. On one occasion, he became furious when he discovered the cook was giving him larger portions just because he was the boss. Anyway, on December 18th, their situation changed. The scientists observed that the drift of the ice pack had stopped and they were no longer making progress. In fact, the winds that had been carrying them towards Paulet Island had swung around and they were pushing them the wrong way, directly east, where there was nothing but open ocean. Shackleton knew he had to try something. The news depressed the men, and he was scared of letting them sit in their frustration. So the next day, the boss led a small scouting party west to test the surface of the pack and see whether another attempt at marching across the ice was even possible. He returned later that evening, having covered 6 miles. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give them hope that maybe progress could be made. So Shackleton announced to the group they would attempt another march. Now, if you're confused about what they were trying to achieve by marching, this was the idea. Shackleton knew they were about 200 miles west of the Antarctic Peninsula, which meant land, and the scientists estimated the edge of the ice pack was about 150 miles away. So the goal was to try and push the boats and sledges close to the ice pack's edge, where it was more likely to break open and where they would be closer to land. But honestly, the primary reason for the march was that Shackleton wanted to keep the men united and working towards a goal. I'll note here that reactions among the men were mixed. That night, arguments broke out in the tents. Lionel Greenstreet, the first officer, was deeply skeptical. He wrote, quote, "As far as I have seen, the going will be awful. I sincerely hope he will give up the idea directly," end quote. Sensing the mood of the retractors, Shackleton decided to sweeten the decision. He announced that they would celebrate Christmas before setting off, and the men could eat as much as they wanted, since much of the food would have to be left anyway. The promise of a proper meal helped win over even those who believed the plan was foolish. And so the march began the next day. However, the condition of the snow was just as bad as it had been in October, if not worse. The sledges sunk in deep, and it took monumental effort to drag them out. The party was constantly forced to stop in order to cut a path through the ice walls that blocked their way. But by far the worst of it was the wetness. Their clothes were soaking, and that's not to mention the tents. The men essentially slept in an inch of icy water. It was only after a few hours, when the stoves had heated the tents enough, that the water turned warmish. Some of the men gave up with the tents entirely and instead lay down on the wooden lifeboats, too exhausted to care. It was horrific work, and they were only making a few miles a day. Morale was beginning to slip. And that brings us to the 27th of December, when the carpenter, McNish, refused to go on and announced he was done. Harry McNish, while a skilled member of the expedition, had always been prone to complaining and was not afraid of confrontation. He now argued that with the ship gone, he was no longer bound to the articles he had sworn when signing up for the expedition. But this wasn't true, and Shackleton had a copy of the articles with him, and they clearly stated that the men would abide by him, whether on sea or on shore. To be honest, it was a pretty pointless protest. It's not as if McNish could go off on his own. He'd be dead within a week. The outburst was simply the result of the psychological strain and fatigue taking its toll. That evening, Shackleton gathered all the men and read the articles out loud to stamp out any other rebellious attitudes. It is also said that Shackleton had a heated private conversation with McNish. We don't know whether this is true, but the rumour was the boss said something in the effect of, "If you don't get back in line tomorrow, you will be shot." And well, the next day, the carpenter was back hauling the sledge. This episode demonstrates how the men were starting to break, but also how swiftly Shackleton would erase any mutinous thoughts. He simply couldn't afford the expedition to turn on itself. I will note that privately, Shackleton was greatly upset by the actions of the carpenter. He was trying everything in his power to keep spirits high, and the revolt felt like a great betrayal. That night, he wrote in his diary, quote, "Everyone working well, except the carpenter. I shall never forget him in this time of strain and stress." End quote. But in some ways, McNish was right. The march was killing them, and 2 days later, Shackleton called a halt. The ice ahead was simply too difficult to cross. The lifeboats were already taking damage from being dragged across the sharp ridges, and there was a real fear they would be smashed beyond repair if the attempt continued, and that would mean disaster. After a full week of hard labour, they had only gained 8 miles. I think at this moment we can see the struggle playing out in Shackleton. To be honest, the march had been a bad idea. He had allowed himself to be driven by emotion, by a need to keep the men active, rather than by what the ice would actually allow. But we also get to see what makes Shackleton great. He was not afraid to admit when he was wrong, nor was he afraid to risk losing authority in the short term if it meant keeping his men alive. Anyway, after some thought, Shackleton announced that the best thing they could do now was to set up camp again. Going back to Ocean Camp was deemed too difficult, and so the men searched for somewhere stable to put the tents. However, this was not easy, and they had to settle for a slushy ice floe that was extremely wet. To be clear, this was not a good time for the expedition. The men were tired and miserable, and people were openly doubting Shackleton. As the men moved into 1916, the mood in the camp was low. They had around 50 days of food left, and to make matters worse, there were far less animals around than expected for this time of year. As a quick side note here, one of the men had quite a shock around this time. Thomas Ord-Lees had been returning from a hunting trip on skis when suddenly a giant animal sprang out of the ice next to him. It lunged at the quartermaster, rows of teeth snapping at the air. It was a sea leopard, and these are truly gigantic beasts, weighing up to 600 kilograms and growing up to 12 feet in length. It chased after Lee before jumping back into the water and stalking him underneath the ice, as it would if hunting a penguin. Ord-Lees shouted out for help from the nearby camp, and Frank Wild arrived just as the creature burst forth from the ice once again. Wild dropped to his knee and fired his rifle as the beast rushed towards him. It was just 30 feet away when it finally dropped. 2 dog teams were needed to bring the carcass back to camp, where it was butchered for meat. And after that, the men were a lot more careful when out hunting. But over the next few days, the luck of the expedition changed. The men managed to kill 4 crab-eater seals and an emperor penguin. Ord-Lees wanted to gather more meat while the game was plentiful, but Shackleton forbade him, as he didn't want to give the impression they were going to be stuck on the ice for a long time. He just didn't think the men could take it. Personally, I think this was a mistake from Shackleton, as it only makes sense to store food while you can. But that's what made him the leader he was. He was reluctant to undergo any act that could be interpreted as an admission of failure. At times, this was a great quality, at others, not so much. I'll let it be said here as well that I don't usually try and comment my own opinion in these videos. I would much rather leave it up to you. I respect you as the audience to make up your own mind and form your own opinions. So that is what I will do. Anyway, the days and weeks went by and the men had no choice but to wait. In fact, they named the new camp Camp Patience. Most stayed in their wet tents, playing cards or just trying to sleep. Shackleton struggled with his health. He had difficulty moving in the morning and experienced chest pain from time to time. But even more, his mental health was wavering. He struggled to sleep and was plagued by anxiety over what would become of them. However, he knew he had to stay strong, if not for himself, for the others. So each day he rose and put on the best face he could. I should mention that during this time, the carpenter, Harry McNish, worked on the 3 lifeboats, improving them and making them seaworthy. He only had a saw, a hammer and a chisel, but managed to make meaningful improvements to all 3 boats, even with limited materials. He was forced to use ingenious solutions. For example, to caulk the planks and make them water resistant, he used cotton lamp wicks and the oil colours from the expedition's artist. Despite their differences, Shackleton was impressed with his resourcefulness and thanked him for his work. Also, as a note here, I know right now we're just waiting around, but I want to give you a sense of how difficult life was on the ice, and insight into the men's mentalities. Just know that soon enough things are going to happen, and this story honestly becomes insane. On January 14th, it was discovered their food supplies were dwindling faster than predicted, and to make matters worse, the seals had disappeared. Shackleton was forced to make a difficult decision. In a quiet voice, he turned to Frank Wild and ordered him to kill 4 of the dog teams, which was 27 dogs in total. They just weren't going to be needed going forward. And once the ice broke up and the men took to the boats, there would be no room for them anyway. Wild took Shackleton's order in his stride, as always, merely walking over to the dogs and leading them away from camp. If you have a pet, you might want to cover their ears, but I will tell you very briefly how it was done. Each dog was taken behind a large ice boulder where Wild sat the animal down, put the revolver to its head and pulled the trigger. Death was instant. Alexander Macklin then dragged the body a short distance away. This was repeated over and over again. And if you're wondering, none of the dogs seemed to sense what was happening. They each were led happily around the ice, oblivious to their fate. Hopefully that makes you feel a little better, although probably not. Frank Wild did say this of the task in his diary, quote, "This duty fell upon me and was the worst job I ever had in my life. I have known many men I would rather shoot than the worst of the dogs." End quote. Frank Hurley's dog team was given an additional day of life, as they were sent back to Ocean Camp to retrieve some of the food that had been left there. It was an exhausting journey, over 10 hours in total, and once they had returned, the dogs were so weak they could barely stand. Hurley merely wrote in his diary, quote, "My dogs will be shot tomorrow," end quote. Once again, many of the men were distraught and angry with Shackleton for authorizing the killings. They thought it was his fault they hadn't stockpiled more food when they had the chance. And again, they were partly right, but to be honest, the dogs just weren't going to be needed from this point on. The issue, however, was that of course, the animals were not merely a tool that could just be discarded so easily. The men had formed deep emotional bonds with them, and it is a basic human need to love something, especially in such a dreary and hopeless place. Because of that, the men felt their loss even harder. So January faded into February, and the wind and rain and snow picked up, causing large discomfort. But nobody minded, since the wind was blowing them in the right direction, closer to Paula Island. Also, by some twist of fate, the forces that controlled the ice pack had rotated their old ocean camp to within less than 6 miles of them. Because of that, Shackleton ordered the men to go and retrieve the third lifeboat that had been left behind. I mention it because this will prove to be a crucial decision later down the line. By mid-February, the men had not sighted a seal in over 2 weeks, and while they still had food, the supply of blubber was running low. Without blubber, the stoves would have no fuel, and they would freeze to death. The men were also beginning to experience health problems from the lack of nutrients in their diet, such as constipation and fatigue. As a quick side note, because this is something we talk about a lot on this channel, you might be wondering about scurvy. Scurvy is a disease caused by the lack of vitamin C. It leads to fatigue, joint pain, cracked skin, swollen gums, and eventually death. It had wiped out countless explorers in the past. But interestingly, the men here were actually doing okay. And the reason is this: fresh meat. Seal and penguin meat contains small trace amounts of vitamin C. As long as it wasn't overcooked, it was just enough to hold scurvy at bay, at least for a while. But just as the fuel situation was getting desperate, the men would catch a major break. Almost overnight, thousands of Adelaide penguins appeared and overran the camp. The men wasted no time in clubbing them to death. In just a few days, over 600 were killed. Now that sounds like a lot, but the Adelaide penguin is a small bird and doesn't possess much blubber or meat. But still, it was a welcomed gift and helped boost the spirits of everyone. Paula Island was now estimated to be only 90 miles away, but there was a problem. The drift of the ice pack had shifted directly north, and unless anything changed, they were likely to simply pass the island by without the ice pack breaking up. Lionel Greenstreet wrote, quote, "My opinion is that the chances of getting to Paula Island now are about 1 in 10, end quote. But then, on March 9th, something happened that gave them real hope. For the first time, the men felt the swell of the open ocean. Beneath their feet, the ice pack began to rise and fall, slowly, just a few inches at a time. It was gentle, but unmistakable. The men were ecstatic. This could mean only one thing: the ice pack was breaking up, and the open water was close. They even began to hear the ice underneath creak and groan. Now, by carefully measuring the rise and fall of the swell, the scientists estimated that the edge of the ice pack was now only about 30 miles away. It was the closest they had been to open water in more than a year. The men hugged each other at the news. Now, while this was undoubtedly good, the ice pack breaking up came with its own dangers. Cracks could open up at a moment's notice, even directly under the tents. Shackleton ordered the camp to be spaced out so that their weight wasn't concentrated in a single place, and a lookout was placed 24 hours a day. However, the men's hope was short-lived. They had expected the swell to grow stronger each passing day as the ice weakened, but overnight it simply disappeared. The next day, they awoke to find the ice lock solid again, as if nothing had happened at all. I mention this because I really want you to feel the emotional roller coaster they were on. One day, freedom seemed close enough to touch. The next, it was gone. And I think it's easy to just forget how precarious their situation was. I mean, these men were floating on a sheet of ice somewhere off the coast of Antarctica, completely at the mercy of the weather and the sea. So every sound and every movement carried enormous meaning for them. I think it's remarkable that for the most part, they managed to hold themselves together mentally at all. On March 31st, Alf Cheetham, third officer, was on watch duty when he shouted, "Crack, crack, lash up and stow." The men rushed out of their tents to see 2 cracks running along the ice, directly through the camp. One of them was 20 feet long. The men scrambled to save all the equipment and supplies. A little later, another crack appeared, right under one of the lifeboats, and the men quickly moved it to safety. Things settled down after that, but they were constantly alert the whole day. Shackleton implemented a 4-hour watch system, so half the men would be alert and fully dressed at any time, ready to spring into action. On a positive note, during the chaos, Frank Wild actually managed to shoot and kill an 1,000-pound sea lion. The men were ecstatic to have fresh meat, and even went through its stomach so they could harvest the half-digested fish it had eaten. While there was some good news in the camp, Shackleton took the opportunity to kill the last of the dogs. And this time, there wasn't much protest. After the killings, the carcasses were skinned, butchered, and prepared for eating. The men actually decided to taste the dog first, over the sea lion, as they hungered for red meat. Tom Crean took some over to Shackleton and said, quote, "I've just bought a bit of Nelson for you to try," end quote. And if you're wondering, that's it for the dogs, so don't worry, there's no more. The next day, Frank Worsley, the best navigator, managed to get an accurate reading and discovered their location had shifted 20 miles to the east. And the next day, they saw an island on the horizon. This was Elephant Island, about 50 miles away. It was mountainous and the men could see tall, jagged peaks. Elephant Island was now their last hope. If the men wanted land, it would almost certainly have to be there. Beyond this island, there was nothing but open ocean and death. The issue was that Elephant Island was uninhabited, remote, and not visited by whalers. Their chances of being rescued there was close to zero. But that didn't matter right now. All that did was that they reach land. And after breakfast on April 9th, Shackleton felt the time was near. Lanes of water were opening up all around them. He gave the order, strike the tents and clear the boats. The men immediately rushed to disassemble the remainder of the camp, and just a few minutes later, the ice floe split in two. All eyes were on Shackleton. The men huddled around the three boats. The boss faced a difficult decision. If they took to the boats too early and the pack reclosed around them, they would be trapped, with nowhere to go. He felt the weight of the moment, and then shortly after, it happened. The wind shifted, and the ice began to fall apart around them. Men could see pools of water forming where the tents had been just an hour earlier. At 12:40 p.m. on April 9th, Shackleton gave the order the men had dreamed about for the last 15 months. In a quiet, tense voice, the boss said, "Launch the boats." Their goal was Elephant Island. The men needed no incentive. They pulled on the oars with all their strength, desperate to reach the open ocean. The first few minutes were chaotic. The ice threatened to close in around them, and men with poles tried to push large boulders away from the boats. Their rowing was clumsy as they were out of practice and full of anxiety, but with every foot of progress they made, the ice seemed looser. Within 15 minutes, the ice floe of Patience Camp disappeared behind them. Finally, they were free of the ice that had been their prison for months. Whatever happened next was new, and as it turns out, almost deadly. They were approaching a giant iceberg when suddenly they heard a deep rumbling that was getting closer. Then, from the right side, they spotted a river-like churn of ice, at least 2 feet high, approaching them. This was an ice tide rip, where a strong current propels ice forward at speed. The men froze in shock. Then Shackleton shouted for the oars, and the men pulled with everything they had. After 20 minutes, the wave of ice behind them slowed, and they were clear. That, to be honest, was an insane moment. Just after escaping, they had almost been wrecked straight away. But if anything, this was a sign of what they were about to endure. Let me just tell you that this is where the story really starts, because what comes next is almost unbelievable. I'm going to pause for just a second and talk to you about the three boats, as they are essential to the men's survival going forward. Two of the boats, named the Dudley Docker and the Stancomb Wills, which you can see here, were made of heavy solid oak. They were often called bottlenose killer boats because they were designed to hunt bottlenose whales. They were both 21 feet long and had 3 small seats. Both of them were very similar, the only real difference being that McNish had raised the sides of the Dudley Docker slightly to give her more protection. Both vessels were equipped with very small sails. The third boat, and the one Shackleton piloted, was called the James Caird. It was named in honour of the Scottish billionaire who helped fund the expedition that I mentioned at the start of the video. The James Caird was by far the most seaworthy of the 3 boats. She was a little larger, but also more agile in the water. I just want to make clear, these were small vessels. They looked like simple rowing boats, and that's because they pretty much were. The sails they were equipped with were extremely small, something you might see on a local lake or pond. To sail in the most dangerous waters on Earth in such boats was madness, but they had no choice. There were 8 men in the Stancomb Wills, 9 in the Docker, and 11 in the James Caird. To say they were uncomfortably crowded would be an understatement. Don't forget, the boats were packed with all the supplies, tents, and sleeping bags they had, everything they would need to stay alive. And don't forget that Shackleton had gone back to retrieve the Stancomb Wills, and if he had not done so, it's doubtful all the men would have fit into the 2 boats. So that was lucky. Throughout the first afternoon, the men made 7 miles and were happy with their progress. At 5 p.m, the light began to fade, and Shackleton looked for somewhere to shelter for the night. 30 minutes later, they came to a large ice floe, which was around 200 yards wide. Shackleton decided it was sturdy enough to camp on. It took the men a few attempts to land, battling the swell and waves that battered the sides of the ice. But once every man was on the floe and the boat secured, Green, the cook, set up his stove and prepared a meal consisting of dog pemmican and 2 biscuits each. After, they pitched their tents and fell asleep immediately, exhausted from the trials of the day. It was not long before the shout of "Crack-o!" rang out from the man on watch. Everyone stumbled out of their tents, bleary-eyed, not even dressed. But it had been a false alarm, and the men crawled back to their sleeping bags. However, Shackleton couldn't sleep. A feeling of uneasiness washed over him, so he got up and went outside. A few minutes later, there was a horrific snapping sound, and a crack appeared underneath his feet and directly under one of the tents. The ice split apart, and the tent collapsed into the chasm. Shackleton heard a splash. "Somebody's missing," a man shouted. Shackleton rushed forward and wrestled the tent out of the way. He saw a man fighting in the water below, trapped in his sleeping bag. With all his strength, he reached down and dragged the man out of the water. And just a moment later, the ice snapped shut. The unlucky man was Ernie Holness, one of the firemen. He was soaking wet and freezing, but alive. However, there was no time to check on him, because the ice cracked again, leaving all the men and tents on one side, and Shackleton on his own. The men watched helplessly as the boss began to fade away into the darkness. A boat had to be launched to go and retrieve him. It goes without saying that sleep now was impossible. Holness, the man who had fallen through the ice, was shivering uncontrollably, and there were no spare clothes for him to change. To keep him alive, the men had to march him back and forth on the ice all night, so he could warm up. And I have to mention this, Holness was not nearly annoyed about being dunked in the water than he was over the fact he had lost the last of his precious tobacco. He cursed all night long. Dawn came at 5 a.m. It was a hazy and cold morning. The men had listened to the blowing sounds of killer whales inquisitively circling the ice throughout the sleepless night. Elephant Island was not visible on the horizon, and Frank Worsley estimated they were between 30 and 40 miles away. The men were still in the grips of the broken ice pack, not actually on the open sea. They had to wait a few hours for the ice to shift before they could take to the boats. When they did, they encountered a choppy and strong sea. Not before long, they came across a large area of ice-free water. Free from any obstacles, Shackleton ordered their small sails to be raised. It quickly became apparent that the James Caird was the most nimble boat, outpacing the other 2. Shackleton had to continually pull back in order to not get too far ahead of the others. Soon they came to some old ancient ice and followed its edge before finding a passage through, and then they were finally there, the open ocean. But unfortunately, the men did not have time to relish this fact. You see, the ice pack had often been protecting them from the full fury of the weather, but out on the open ocean, they were immediately struck by a fierce wind and angry sea. Somewhere, just 24 miles or so ahead of them, they knew there was land. They pressed on that afternoon, but the wind picked up even more, and the boats began to take on water at an alarming rate. After an hour, Shackleton realised the boats simply weren't up to the task in these conditions. He decided to retreat to the safety of the ice pack for the night. They looked for a floe to camp on, but there were not many candidates. They came across one, which was around 35 yards in diameter. It was old and beaten, the sea having eaten a lot of the ice around the waterline, making it unsteady. After the previous night, Shackleton didn't fancy it at all. He announced they would have to spend the night in the boats. The James Caird pulled up alongside the floe, and the men drove the oars into the ice to keep them steady. The other boats then came alongside, and they lashed them all together. However, it wasn't long before the wind picked up, and the boats bumped against each other dangerously. Snow and ice from the berg was whipped into their faces. It would be impossible to sleep in such conditions, and the men needed rest badly. They hadn't slept in over 36 hours. So at last, out of options, Shackleton relented and gave the order to camp on the iceberg. Just getting on it was not an easy task. The men scrambled up, and then they passed the food, tents and equipment. Worse, they had to get the boats up, which required immense effort. 4 men fell into the water during the operation, including Shackleton and Frank Wild. The men were exhausted. Their hands were blistered and frostbitten from rowing. Their clothes were soaked, and their sleeping bags were wet through. They ate a quick meal and then did their best to sleep. Frank Hurley managed to find the effort to write in his diary, voicing the thought that was in all of the men's minds. Quote, "Please God, let this flow remain throughout the night." End quote. By some miracle, it did. But before dawn, Shackleton got a feeling something was seriously wrong. He looked out of his tent and his heart sank. During the night, the winds and currents had blown huge quantities of splintered ice all around them. And to make matters worse, the iceberg they were on was weakening, with large chunks falling off, splashing into the sea. This was the worst situation Shackleton could imagine. The iceberg could collapse at any moment, but he could not launch the boats now. If he did, they would have been ripped to pieces within minutes by the churn of ice. All they could do was wait and pray the currents would bring them open water. Shackleton had the men standing ready for hours. They even ate lunch standing up. All the while, the iceberg was collapsing piece by piece around them. If an opening never came, they would be trapped. And then, at 2 p.m, they got their chance, when a pool of open water materialized. Within seconds, the boats were launched, the men pushing with all their strength to safety. It was here that Shackleton and Frank Worsley discussed their next move. Up until this moment, their destination had been Elephant Island, which was estimated to be around 40 miles away, but the conditions of the wind and currents were just not making that viable. So they decided to switch plan. They would try a place called King George Island that was around 80 miles away to their southwest. It was further away, but the winds were favourable if they held, and King George Island was frequently visited by whalers, so they had a good chance of being rescued. I just want to pause here for a moment and say that if you're a little confused with where the men were trying to reach, don't worry, so were they. The problem was the winds and currents just kept shifting hour after hour, which meant Shackleton was forced to adapt his plans over and over again. He could not fight nature, so he had to go with what was being given to him. Don't worry about the locations too much for now, as it will all become clear, and just know that this will come to an end. So the men rowed all afternoon towards the southwest, where King George Island lay. When they finally reached a stretch of open water, the sails were hoisted, and the imbalance between the 3 boats became clear again. By 5 p.m, darkness was closing in, and Shackleton feared they might collide with ice if they continued under sail. The men took to the oars and pressed on. They eventually came alongside a small ice floe, but there would be no more camping. After the perils of the 2 previous nights, Shackleton was adamant they would not camp again. The only man allowed onto the ice was the cook, Charles Green, who prepared a quick meal. And then, once they had eaten, the men were back on the oars and continued on into the darkness. This was a long, terrible night. The men took turn at the oars, and exhausting as it was, Rowing at least kept them warm. There was no chance of sleep. There was just nowhere to lie down, and icy spray constantly broke over the boats, soaking them through. The men huddled together in silence, enduring the darkness hour by hour. Every so often, the stillness was shattered by the explosive sound of water being blown into the air as a whale surfaced nearby. Many of the men feared the boats would be struck by one of the great beasts, only adding to their anxiety. When dawn finally came at 5 a.m. on the 12th of April, the men didn't feel human, but they had survived the night. Frank Worsley managed to take a sextant reading, bracing himself against the mast of the Dudley Docker to steady the instrument. The men waited in tense silence as he worked through the calculations, but the result was devastating. They had gained no progress, not a single mile. In fact, they were now 124 miles away from King George Island and 60 miles away from Elephant Island, which had been their original target. Overnight, they had been caught in a powerful current that had carried them far off course. The men were stunned by the news. Some openly wept. They begged Worsley to take another sighting, hoping for a mistake, but the second reading only confirmed it. The problem was clear. The winds and currents were just working against them. Shackleton was beginning to understand that brute effort alone would not save them. Once again, Shackleton was forced to change plan. Now Elephant Island remained the closest land, but it lay outside the pack, in the danger of the open sea. So instead, they chose a place named Hope Bay, which was on the tip of the Antarctic Peninsula. It was further away, but hopefully the conditions would be more favourable. The men worked the oars all day, in utter exhaustion. That evening, they found themselves in loose ice and a choppy sea. The temperature dropped, and the men were shivering uncontrollably in the boats. Once again, they tried to find a float they could tie up to for the night, but there just wasn't anything large enough. At last, they came alongside a tiny fragment of ice. It was all they had, so they clung to it, using it as a shield against the wind and waves. By now, the men were beyond exhaustion. More than anything, they needed sleep. They stretched canvas over each boat, attempting to make a floating shelter to keep out some of the bitter wind. A stove was lit, and they managed to successfully heat some milk, which they drank scalding hot, enjoying the brief moment of warmth. But this tiny moment of comfort and relative safety wouldn't last. The wind shifted, and instead of the ice floe protecting them, the boats were driven into its sharp edges. There was no time to think. Shackleton shouted for the lines to be cut before the hulls were damaged beyond repair. And just like that, they were on the open ocean with no protection, and it was night time. How long could they go on like this? Snow began to fall, and the temperature plunged. They could hear the water freezing around them. The men's clothes stiffened and froze to their bodies. The slightest movement caused skin to brush against newly frozen fabric, sending jolts of pain through them. They tried to keep still, but exhaustion and violent shivering made that impossible. Shackleton thought to himself that some of the men wouldn't last the night. But somehow they did. When the morning light illuminated their faces, they hardly looked human. They had slept once in the last 4 nights, but they were alive. Shackleton described the men, quote, "Their lips were cracked, and their eyes and eyelids showed red in their salt-encrusted faces. Obviously, we must make land quickly, and I decided to run for Elephant Island." End quote. Yes, you heard that right. For the 4th and last time, Shackleton was forced to change destination. The winds had shifted, and Elephant Island was closest. At this point, closeness was all that mattered. He did not believe the men would survive another night in the boats. It was Elephant Island or death. By noon, they were finally making good progress. The sun broke through the cloud, and the men raced towards Elephant Island with renewed urgency. But soon they reached the open sea, and the waves and wind hit them head on. The boats struggled to stay together, sometimes vanishing from one another entirely. By 4 p.m, the wind strengthened further, driving waves over the men, adding to their misery. Sensing morale was close to breaking, Shackleton let the men eat as much food as they wanted. Their bodies needed the fuel, and so did their spirits. As the sun began to set, Frank Worsley urged Shackleton to press on through the night, but the boss refused. It was difficult enough keeping the boats together in daylight, and in the dark, he feared they would lose one another entirely. Their best chance of survival, he believed, was to stay together, whatever the cost. He was especially concerned about the Stancomb Wills. She was the least seaworthy of the three, and Shackleton was convinced that if she became separated, she would be lost. They were forced to face another torturous night in the boats. In his book, Endurance, Alfred Lansing later described this moment by simply writing, quote, "Never was there a worse night," end quote. Waves hammered the boats relentlessly. The men wrapped themselves in the tent cloths and canvas, anything they could find to hold in a little warmth. Worse still, they were now out of fresh water. Their mouths were swollen and cracked from constant exposure to salt spray. In order to get a trace of moisture, they began chewing on the frozen seal meat. Their bodies were stiff, frozen, and aching after 3 days and nights trapped in the same positions, battered by the cold and sea alike. It's hard to imagine this level of suffering. I will note here that through those long, terrible hours of darkness, some men remained stoic. Frank Wild, Tom Crean, and Worsley, they stayed at their post at the tillers as the waves crashed over them and the wind stung their faces. As I mentioned before, these were hard men, and Shackleton relied on them to keep the others believing. Frank Worsley described the rest of the men at this point, saying, quote, "At least half of the party were insane. Fortunately, not violent, simply helpless and hopeless," end quote. Then, when the sun finally rose on the 14th of April, the men saw it, the unmistakable outline of Elephant Island, just 30 miles away. After days of terror and exhaustion, the joy was indescribable. Shackleton turned to Frank Worsley and praised his navigation. Against everything the sea had thrown at them, Worsley had brought them to land. Shackleton gave the order to push on immediately. The men had gone nearly 80 hours without sleep and were at the absolute limit of endurance. Hours after hours they rowed that day, and Elephant Island slowly grew larger on the horizon. By noon they had covered nearly half the distance, and by 2 p.m. they were just 10 miles away. But it was too good to be true. An hour later, when they checked, they realized they had made no progress at all. The winds had shifted. The men could scarcely believe it. They were so close now, close enough to see the shape of the land, but still unable to reach it. It felt as though the sea itself was toying with them. Shackleton tried everything he could to force progress, but the small boats were just simply outmatched. To make matters worse, they had drifted into a treacherous zone just off the island, where opposing currents collided, whipping the water into chaos far worse than the open ocean beyond. Every boat had to be bailed constantly just to stay afloat. As the sun began to fade, Shackleton was terrified of spending another night on the boats. The men were giving up one by one. And just because you can't write this, that evening a storm descended on the boats, the worst they had faced so far. In the James Caird, Harry McNish fell asleep at the tiller in the middle of the raging gale. Frank Wild took over for him, unshaken and unfazed. Shackleton was brought to tears at the strength of his friend, describing the moment, saying, quote, "His still blue eyes looked out to the day ahead," end quote. In the Dudley Docker, Frank Worsley had now been awake for nearly 90 hours, navigating continuously. When he finally tried to move his hands from the helm, he found he couldn't, as his fingers were locked rigid, frozen in place. On the Stancomb Wills, 4 of the 8 men were now useless, slumped and barely responsive. And yet, at the tiller, Tom Crean stood strong, willing the men on. The Irishman was a force to behold. That night, the full fury of the storm blew in, and all the men could do was to try and stay alive. The Stancomb Wills had to be tied to the James Caird in order for the boat to remain afloat in the rough sea. The lives of the men depended on that line holding. If it broke, the Wills and everyone in her would be cast out into the darkness and to certain death. Through it all, Shackleton stood the entire time, willing the men on. He had not slept since leaving Patience Camp. But then, in the darkest hours of the night, the unthinkable happened. A heavy wave broke over the James Caird, and when Shackleton turned to look for the other boats, the Dudley Docker and her crew were gone. In that instant, Shackleton was certain they had been lost, but there was nothing he could do. The sea had simply reached out and snatched them. For the boss, it was his lowest moment of the entire journey. His worst fear had come true, and after all this, men had been lost. When the sun rose on April 15th, they were met with an amazing sight. Elephant Island was right in front of them, just a mile away. They were astounded. Shackleton led the James Caird and the Stancomb Wills along the coast, searching for somewhere to land. For hours, there was nothing but jagged rocks and towering cliffs. But then they saw it, a small narrow beach at the northwest tip of the island. Shackleton knew this was it. And just as he gave the order to advance, his voice barely above a whisper, something amazing happened. Out of the grey mist along the coast, the missing Dudley Docker appeared, with her entire crew aboard. After being separated during the night, Frank Worsley had taken the Docker along the coastline, desperately searching for a place to land. By an insane coincidence, he had spotted the very same small beach that Shackleton was now aiming for. It should be said that Worsley had done an incredible job at navigating the boat through the perilous storm. Cheers erupted from the men at the sight of the Docker, and Shackleton was relieved beyond words. And so the boats rushed for the beach. They fought their way through reefs and submerged rocks, but at last all three boats made it to safety. Shackleton gave Blackborough, the youngest member of the expedition, the honour of stepping ashore first. The young man took a few steps before collapsing on the rocks, exhausted beyond measure and unable to walk on his frostbitten feet. They had done it. It had been 497 days since the men had last set foot on solid ground. They celebrated as if they had won the lottery, and in a way they had. Some threw stones into the air and laughed hysterically. Others merely collapsed onto the rocks and wept. Frank Hurley took this photo of the moment the boats landed. What an incredible picture that is. The men pulled the boats to higher ground and unloaded the supplies. It was at that moment that one of the engineers, named Lewis Rickinson, collapsed. He had suffered a heart attack, which was obviously serious, but thankfully not life-threatening. Anyway, once the immediate danger had passed and Rickinson seemed to be okay, more or less, the men gathered together in a circle. Charles Green set up his stove and heated the milk, which they drank almost boiling hot. Shackleton thanked the men for what they had endured and for holding themselves together when everything had been stacked against them. More than anything, he felt overwhelming relief, as by some miracle, they were all still alive. And so, the men of endurance had reached land. Now, there were only three things on their mind: food, water, and sleep. Some seals were spotted nearby, and the more able men killed 4 of them. They were immediately cut into steaks and fried. Alfred Lansing describes the moment, saying, quote, "Finally, the food was ready, and they ate. It was not breakfast, lunch, or dinner, but rather one long, intermittent meal. As soon as they had finished the first round of steaks, Green put more on the fire. When these were ready, the men stopped and ate again. It wasn't until nearly 3 p.m. that they had eaten all they could hold." End quote. Then, the next thing was sleep. The men climbed into their soaked bags without a care in the world. Throughout the night, some men were awoken for a 1-hour watch, but none of them minded. It was just another excuse to eat more food. However, the elation wouldn't last. In the morning, Shackleton shared some bad news. They would have to move to another location. The men were horrified at the idea. Move? Back in the boats? Oh God, no. But the reason was solid. The beach was not a good spot. The men could see tide lines on the cliffs that suggested in bad weather this beach would be underwater. They had been very fortunate to be able to land here at all. So a scouting party, including Frank Wild and Tom Crean, was sent out to look for a more suitable place. They returned later that evening, having searched all day, and there was only one spot that offered hope, just 7 miles down the coast. On April 17th, the men loaded up the boats and made their way to their new home. The new beach was larger and was abundant with seals and penguins, so at least they wouldn't starve for the time being. Now, the men were still in a very bad way. In the most critical conditions was Purse Blackborough, whose feet were severely frostbitten, and Hubert Hudson, who had a debilitating pain in his lower back. Lewis Rickenson was also largely immobile from his heart attack. They pitched their wet tents as high above the tide mark as they could and collapsed into sleep. But it didn't last long. During the night, a violent blizzard swept over the camp. One tent was torn to ribbons and the others were flattened. Some men crawled into the upturned boats for shelter, while others simply just lay beneath the collapsed canvas, too exhausted to do anything. They remained like that until around 11 a.m. the next morning, when finally the storm eased. Almost immediately, Shackleton ordered the men back to work. He was anxious about food and wanted to secure as much as possible while the opportunity existed. The men went out and killed over 77 penguins in total. Now, I just want to pause for a moment and talk about the bigger picture. For days, the men, and to be honest us, hadn't been able to think beyond the next hour of staying alive, keeping the boats afloat, and reaching land. But now they had done it, reality was beginning to sink in. Let me remind you, Elephant Island was not inhabited by humans. It was bleak, violent, and utterly desolate. Shackleton had chosen it for one reason only. It was the closest land available. But that was the problem. Elephant Island was incredibly remote. As far as the men knew, no one had ever landed on the island, and it was never visited by whalers. That meant rescue was improbable. So yes, they were alive, but they were now stranded on a barren island, which had some of the worst weather on Earth, with no ship, no means of communication, and no way home. There was still work to do. Shackleton gathered the men. He announced that he and 5 others would take the James Caird, the most seaworthy of the boats, and sail to civilization. The question was, where? In the end, Shackleton decided on South Georgia Island, the whaling station where they had begun the journey on the Endurance so long ago. Now, I'm going to be honest with you, this plan was madness. South Georgia Island was over 800 miles away, more than 10 times the distance they had just travelled. To reach it, Shackleton would be travelling in a tiny boat, crossing arguably the most dangerous ocean on the planet in winter. They had barely survived the last journey on the boats, and what Shackleton was proposing was just impossible. The problem was, no one else had a better idea. It was their only chance of rescue. If all went well, it was thought he could make the voyage in about 3 to 4 weeks. One of the biggest dangers of this journey would be successfully navigating to the island. If they missed it or sailed past it, Shackleton would never be able to turn around due to the strong currents. After South Georgia Island, there was nothing but open water for 3,000 miles until Africa. If they missed the island, they were dead. And let's not forget, the only instruments they had to help them navigate was a sextant and a chronometer. But it didn't matter. The boss had made his plan. And so Shackleton carefully selected the 5 men that would accompany him. The first was Frank Worsley. This was no surprise, as Worsley was by far the best navigator, and his skills had been paramount in getting them this far. The second man was Tom Crean. To put it simply, Crean would keep going until the bitter end. He had fared the best physically out of any man up to this point, and Shackleton needed him. By the way, Tom Crean actually begged Shackleton to come along, which shows you what kind of man he was. The third member was Harry McNish, the carpenter. Now this might come as a surprise, as Shackleton and McNish had clashed more than once during the expedition. But there were 2 very good reasons for this. First, Shackleton didn't want to leave the carpenter on Elephant Island, where the men would be waiting for weeks, possibly even months. It was well known that the carpenter was prone to brooding and complaining. so left behind, he could easily become a problem for morale. But there was another very good reason. Whatever his temperament, there was no denying McNish's skill. He was an exceptional carpenter, and he would be needed on the James Caird. The last two men were named Jack Vincent and Timothy McCarthy. I haven't really mentioned them up to this point in the story, and to be honest, they were picked for nothing else other than just being strong and experienced sailors. And you might be wondering about Frank Wild, Shackleton's right-hand man. I mean, why wasn't he chosen to go on the voyage? The reason was simple. Wild was needed for something more important. He had to stay behind on Elephant Island and lead the others. Frank Wild was stern and deeply respected. Shackleton trusted him more than anyone. If the voyage was a success, rescue would still take weeks, possibly even months, and during that time, someone would need to be there to keep the men together. Shackleton knew that Wild was the man for the job. And so, preparations were made to ready the James Caird for the Great Voyage. McNish, the carpenter, immediately set to work on the Caird. He constructed a makeshift deck, strengthened the keel, and did everything he could to turn a small lifeboat into something capable of surviving the open Southern Ocean. All of this was made far more difficult by a fierce blizzard that blew in. Winds reached up to 120 miles per hour. The weather was so severe that there was genuine concern some of the men might not last even a month if things continued like this. While McNish worked on the boat, the others focused on shelter. They turned the Dudley Docker upside down and converted it into a makeshift hut. They also attempted to dig a cave into the face of a nearby glacier, but the ice was rock hard and the progress was painfully slow. Despite the conditions, Shackleton was adamant that he would leave the moment the weather allowed. There was simply no time to waste. Winter was closing in, and soon the sea would freeze over, and if that happened, escape would be impossible for months. The thought of being trapped, inactive, while his men slowly weakened, terrified him. The sooner he left, the sooner there was a chance of rescue. By April 22nd, the carpenter finished his work, and considering the tools and materials available, he had performed a small miracle. The hull had been reinforced, a canvas deck was stretched over the boat to provide shelter, and the planks were sealed using seal's blood. Hundreds of pounds of rocks and shingle were loaded into the bottom of the boat to act as ballast, which would help to keep her stable in rough seas. For drinking water, 2 barrels of melted snow were brought on board. They also packed 2 stoves in case one failed. In terms of other important items, there were 6 sleeping bags, 30 matches, some sledging rations, binoculars, a compass, fishing line, and Shackleton's double-barreled shotgun. The food was calculated to last 4 weeks, and Shackleton later wrote, quote, "For if we did not make South Georgia in that time, we were sure to go under," end quote. Frank Worsley brought the charts he had torn from books in Endurance's library before the ship was lost and sealed them in a waterproof case. He also carried his sextant and the last remaining chronometer of the expedition. They had started with 24, and this last one was so valuable that Worsley wore it around his neck at all times. That night, Shackleton and Frank Wild talked long into the darkness. They discussed everything: what to do if no rescue came, how supplies should be rationed, even how tobacco should be distributed among the men. Shackleton then wrote a letter formally transferring command to Wild. He signed it off by saying, quote, "You can convey my love to my people and say I tried my best," end quote. Now, if Shackleton never returned and he was presumed lost, Wild was instructed to wait until the following spring. If no rescue arrived by then, he was to take the remaining boats on a final desperate attempt to reach Deception Island, which lay 200 miles to the southwest. It was a last resort, and to be honest, was probably suicide, but it would be the best option. Finally, on the morning of April 24th, the bad weather relented, and the sun even made a rare appearance. This was the day Shackleton had been waiting for, and a farewell breakfast was prepared. The men stood around awkwardly, cracking jokes and trying to lighten the mood. But no one could ignore what was about to happen. What Shackleton was attempting was extraordinarily dangerous, with only a slim chance of success. These were more than likely their final moments together. Shackleton spoke to Wild one last time and then shook the hands of every man. Help was needed to launch the James Caird since she was so heavy due to the ballast. But eventually, a large wave crashed down and pulled her out to sea. The men on the beach yelled, "Good luck, boss," and Shackleton turned to face them with his fist raised. Then he was gone. A tiny boat on a great heaving ocean. The voyage of the James Caird was underway. And believe me, nothing we have seen yet compares with what is to come. I'm going to stick with Shackleton on the James Caird for now, as I don't want to interrupt the momentum of the story. But just know that later we will return to the men on Elephant Island and see how they adapted to life while they awaited rescue. But let's keep going. As the tiny figures on the beach disappeared over the horizon, Frank Worsley guided the James Caird north. Before long, they encountered an old enemy, ice. Giant floes drifted silently past in the grey water, a constant reminder of how fragile their position was. Even on this relatively calm first day, waves broke over the sides of the boat, soaking the men. It was a warning and an indication of what lay ahead. That evening, they ate their first meal beneath the protection of the canvas decking McNish had constructed. Lighting the stove and keeping it steady while food was prepared was no easy task, but worth the effort for something hot. There was barely room to move, never mind sit upright. They ate hunched over, knees to their chest and dripping wet. That first night, Shackleton and Worsley sat side by side in the darkness, steering the tiny boat and scanning the Black Sea ahead. They prayed they wouldn't encounter ice. Ice was arguably the greatest danger of all. One collision in the dark, and it would all be over. As the boat creaked and heaved beneath them, Shackleton rolled cigarettes and shared his doubts with Worsley. He spoke openly about the gamble they were taking, but both men agreed they had no real choice. South Georgia was the best option, and the only hope they had. It's worth pausing for a moment to just imagine what that first night must have felt like. 6 men on one tiny boat on the most dangerous ocean on Earth. And remember, they were in pitch black darkness, and there was 800 miles to go. Unsettling doesn't really cut it. Shackleton divided the men into 2 watches. One consisted of himself, Tom Crean, and Harry McNish. The other was Frank Worsley, McCarthy, and Vincent. They worked 4 hours on, 4 hours off. During each watch, one man steered, while the others bailed water, which was almost a constant need. The men off watch tried to rest beneath the deck, although sleeping and eating was nearly impossible. The boat was crammed with supplies. There was hardly any room to lie down. The only available space was at the bottom of the hull amongst the ballast. The men would have to crawl on their hands and knees in a narrow space that only measured 5 by 7 feet. Then they would slither into a wet sleeping bag on top of the rocks and stones which were there to keep the boat stable. Imagine trying to sleep on rocks in soaked clothing on a violently pitching boat in a confined space. As I said, sleep was impossible, and many times they awoke in a jolt with the terrifying sensation of drowning. Sometimes the James Caird would lurch upwards so suddenly that a man would be lifted into the air and then slammed back down among the stones. And one thing I should mention is that the reindeer fur sleeping bags the men used were never designed to be wet, and as a result they were beginning to fall apart, shredding hair everywhere, which ended up in their mouths and their food and their clothes. In terms of clothing, each man wore wool sweaters, 2 pairs of socks, and simple cloth trousers. It helped against the wind, but again, none of it was waterproof. Once it was wet, it stayed wet. Despite these dreadful conditions, they made good progress over the first 3 days, though the weather was beginning to worsen. Frank Worsley managed to take a sextant reading, which was no small achievement. To do so, he had to snatch a glimpse of the sun between racing clouds, while the boat rolled violently. Then, bracing himself as best he could, he aligned the sextant with the horizon. It was difficult work and with no room for error. The results showed that they had already travelled 128 miles, but they were far off the position Worsley had expected. Navigating in the darkness was especially difficult, and it was all too easy to get blown off course. But everyone knew what was at stake. If they overshot South Georgia, there would be no second chance. The currents would sweep them past the island and out into more than 3,000 miles of empty ocean. Death would be certain. Worsley's calculations revealed something else as well. They were now entering the eastern reaches of the Drake Passage. If you're not familiar with the Drake Passage, it is considered one of the most feared stretches of water on the planet. At these southern latitudes, the wind circles the globe almost uninterrupted by land, allowing it to build terrifying strength. As a result, hurricane-force winds are common, and the waves produced in the area are legendary, some reaching well over 100 feet. There is no other place on Earth quite like it. When Charles Darwin encountered these seas in 1833, he wrote, quote, "The sight is enough to make a landsman dream for a week about death, peril, and shipwreck," end quote. And soon, Shackleton and the men got a taste of those seas for themselves. On April 26th, they crossed the 60th parallel of latitude, and with it, entered a different world entirely. They were met by 50-foot waves, rolling in endlessly, one after another. Alfred Lansing describes the scene in his book Endurance, writing, quote, "Once every 90 seconds or less, the Caird's sail would go slack as one of these gigantic waves loomed astern, possibly 50 feet above her, and threatening surely to bury her under 1,000,000 tons of water," end quote. I mean, this is just insane. A tiny open boat riding 50-foot waves, completely dwarfed by the power of nature. And this was happening hundreds, thousands of times a day, over and over again. At this point, life was no longer measured in days or nights. It was measured in hours or minutes. The men lived from watch to watch, just trying to survive their 4 hours on duty before collapsing among the ballast below. It's hard to comprehend the emotional fatigue they must have felt. With the rise of every wave, they wondered if the Caird would be smashed to pieces, day after day. And through all of this, Frank Worsley still had to navigate. He had to take sightings and keep them on course. It's just unbelievable. There was one advantage to the crazy weather, and that was that the winds and currents were speeding them towards South Georgia Island. By April 28th, they had covered 238 miles, about a third of the distance. But then, on April 30th, the wind shifted suddenly to the south, and the temperature plunged close to freezing. It was likely the winds were blowing off a nearby ice pack, which explains the coldness. The issue was, the strength of the wind began forcing the bow of the James Caird down into the sea. Each plunge sent water pouring over the sides of the boat, far more than the men could hope to pump or bail out. Shackleton realised they were in serious danger and was forced to make a hard decision. He ordered the sails to be lowered and the sea anchor to be deployed. Now, this helped stabilise the boat and stopped her being driven under by the waves, but there was a heavy cost. It meant they were no longer making progress. Up until now, every hardship had at least been endured, with the knowledge that they were moving forward. That comfort was gone. Now they were simply fighting to stay afloat. And it wasn't long before another problem emerged. The water they had taken on board began to freeze. Ice formed along the hull, the deck, and the rigging, adding dangerous weight. The James Caird grew sluggish and unstable, struggling to right herself after each wave. As evening fell, it became clear the situation was worsening. That night, Tom Crean, Frank Worsley, and McCarthy would take turns climbing out onto the deck with chisels and hacking the ice away as best they could. Each time, it took around 20 minutes, and by the time they had finished, they were soaked through to their skin. They slid back beneath the deck, shivering uncontrollably. The issue was that in the darkness and heavy seas, it was impossible to clear all the ice, and by morning, the boat would once again be encased. This cycle repeated itself day after day. Chisel the ice, get drenched, freeze, and watch it form again. It was depressing, to say the least. I should note here that the physical condition of the men was deteriorating rapidly. Shackleton was suffering badly from the sciatica he had experienced before, and every man aboard was showing signs of frostbite. Harry McNish complained that his feet were causing him severe pain, When he removed his boots, his skin was swollen and dead white. The others then checked their own and found the same. John Vincent was in the worst condition of all. He suffered badly from rheumatism, and the constant cold only made it worse. But it wasn't just the temperature. The cramped, jolting nature of the boat was just brutal. There was nowhere to stretch out, nowhere to relax or ease their aching muscles. Their bodies tightened day by day, inching closer to breaking point. At this time, Frank Worsley reported that Vincent was close to death. Shackleton checked his pulse constantly and gave him hot milk whenever his shivering worsened. The boss later wrote that Vincent had, quote, ceased to be an active member of the crew, end quote. His decline appeared to be as much mental as it was physical. He was withdrawn and looked resigned to his fate. Timothy McCarthy, on the other hand, was a complete contrast. He was regarded as the greatest optimist any of them had ever met. Frank Worsley, who at one point was feeling depressed and exhausted himself, once went to relieve him at the helm during a raging storm and was greeted with a grin. McCarthy simply said, quote, "It's a grand day, sir," end quote. And well, Worsley couldn't help but smile after that. In terms of the carpenter, McNish, there wasn't much comment. Shackleton merely noted that, quote, "The carpenter was suffering particularly, but he showed grit and spirit," end quote. And then there was Tom Crean. Crean remained as stoic as ever. He and Shackleton had formed a special bond during the voyage, and somehow, even in the darkest moments, they found ways to make each other laugh. When Shackleton and Crean were getting rest in the dark depths of the hold, the others would hear rumbling laughter drift out, along with their Irish accents. On May 2nd, the sea anchor broke, and the James Caird began to lurch violently, rolling unpredictably in the swell. For a moment, things looked desperate, but then luckily, the storm began to ease. As the winds reduced, the men were able to raise a sail, which helped stabilize the boat. And then, for the first time in days, they caught a much-needed break. The clouds parted, the seas calmed, and the sun broke through onto a blue sky. The men could hardly remember the last time they had felt its warmth. It lifted their spirits immediately. They spread their clothes and sleeping bags out on the deck to dry, which improved the quality of life immeasurably, even if it was just for a day or two. The clear weather also meant that Frank Worsley was able to take a sighting, and the result brought a surge of renewed hope. They were now halfway to South Georgia Island. The effect of this news on morale was immediate. Halfway, for the first time, the men allowed themselves to believe that maybe they could actually do this. But of course, the good weather lasted just 2 days, and the sea was not finished with them yet. Just after midnight on May 4th, Shackleton relieved Worsley at the helm. Over the previous hours, the sea and sky had been steadily growing angrier once again. Shackleton turned around and thought he saw a gap in the clouds above, a possible sign that the weather was easing. He even called out to the others that things looked better to the south. Then, a few seconds later, he heard a hiss. The sound deepened, rising into a low roar. Shackleton turned back towards the gap in the clouds, and his eyes went wide. What he had taken for a break in the cloud was not sky at all. It was the crest of an enormous wave, towering above them and rushing straight towards the James Caird. A tidal wave. He had time for only one shout. "For God's sake, hold on, it's got us." Then, time seemed to stop. Shackleton felt the boat rise higher and higher, lifted by an immense force beneath them. The Caird climbed as if she was being carried up the side of a mountain. There was a brief, unnatural pause, a single moment, and then Shackleton's stomach dropped away as the boat plunged downwards. Then, everything was water. For an instant, he had no idea whether they were even the right way up. He was certain the boat must have been smashed to pieces. But then, his vision cleared, and he saw the water rushing off the deck. And incredibly, the James Caird was still afloat. The others scrambled out from beneath the deck and began bailing furiously. If another wave like that struck them, Shackleton knew it would be the end. For over 2 hours, the men pumped and bailed without stopping, their arms burning, their bodies in shock, and slowly the water level dropped. Once out of immediate danger, the men just turned to look at each other in stunned disbelief. Later, Shackleton would write, quote, "During 26 years' experience of the ocean in all its moods, I had never encountered a wave so gigantic," end quote. And some of you might be thinking, a tidal wave? Come on, I don't believe that. But it's speculated that the wave had been triggered by the collapse of a massive glacier falling into the sea. Whatever the case, it was a miracle they were still alive. I mean, what else can I say? It's just incredible. On May 5th, the men covered more than 96 miles, the best run of the journey so far. It had now been 12 days since they had set out on this desperate voyage, and every man was in a terrible state. Even Shackleton himself was struggling. He had grown moody and withdrawn. The misery of life on the boat felt endless. There's a small anecdote from this time that I think says a lot. A small bird appeared and began circling the boat, repeatedly trying to land near Shackleton. After a few minutes, the boss suddenly lost his temper, flailing his arms and swearing at it as it darted around him. It's a small moment, but I think it speaks volumes. These men were utterly exhausted, physically, mentally, emotionally. The constant cold, fear, and fatigue was grinding them down day after day. The only exception was perhaps Tom Crean. Now, I've mentioned Crean a few times already, but I want to pause here and just give you a little bit more context, because he really was an incredible individual. Tom Crean had previously served on another Antarctic expedition where he had earned a reputation for endurance, courage, and self-sacrifice. During that expedition, one of the men became crippled by scurvy, unable to walk and close to death. With no supplies left and rescue uncertain, Crean made an extraordinary decision. He set out alone across the Antarctic plateau in an attempt to reach the nearest supply depot and get help. He walked 35 miles in 18 hours without a tent, without survival equipment, and with only a little chocolate and 3 biscuits to sustain him. By the time he reached the checkpoint, he was barely able to stand. An hour after his arrival, a blizzard struck, one that would almost certainly have killed him if he had still been on the ice. Because of Crean's effort, a successful rescue was mounted and the stranded men were brought back to base camp alive. For this act, Crean was awarded the Albert Medal for life-saving. So that was Tom Crean, a hard man. And in terms of what he was like while on the James Caird, author Michael Smith wrote this of him in his book, By Endurance We Conquer. Quote, "Crean was unbreakable, standing imperturbably against everything the violent forces of nature hurled at him, almost oblivious to the roaring winds and crashing waves. He could be seen at the tiller, puffing on his pipe and singing songs in the Irish language, past unrecognised by his shipmates." End quote. I think that is such an awesome quote. It really gives you a sense of this stoic Irishman who could endure anything. Now, as they drew closer to South Georgia Island, Frank Worsley was growing increasingly anxious about his navigation. In almost 2 weeks at sea, he had only been able to sight the sun 4 times, and 2 of those sightings were through thick cloud, lasting only moments. Because of that uncertainty, Worsley warned Shackleton that he could only guarantee their position within a margin of about 10 miles. That might not sound like much, but here it was everything. It could mean the difference between reaching land or not. So a decision was made that they would aim for the western side of South Georgia. The reasoning for this was as follows. If they missed the island to the west, the prevailing winds and currents would likely carry them around to the eastern side, giving them another chance to make landfall. But if they aimed for the east side first and missed, they would be blown straight back out into the ocean and to their death. But of course, there was a problem with this. All of the whaling stations were on the eastern side of the island. On the western side, there would be no hope of rescue. But to be honest, that was a problem for another time. All that mattered at this point was land. On May 7th, things took a turn for the worse. It was discovered that the remaining keg of fresh water had leaked and become contaminated with seawater when the boat had been swamped. There was now barely any drinkable water left at all. The men were forced to ration themselves to just half a cup a day. On May 8th, a thick fog rolled in. Frank Worsley estimated they were now just 10 to 12 miles from South Georgia Island. This made everyone anxious. The island was home to mountains, some of which rising over 10,000 feet. Surely they would see them by now. Doubt began to creep in. Had Worsley miscalculated? Could they have missed the island? A few hours later, something was spotted overhead. 2 cormorants flew above the boat. The cormorant is a bird that rarely ventures more than 15 miles away from land. They looked at one another, scarcely able to speak, and then, out of the mist, Timothy McCarthy spotted something ahead, a black cliff patched with snow. "Land," he cried. The shape appeared for only an instant before vanishing back into the fog, but that was enough. Every man on the boat had seen it. There was now no doubt. "We've done it," said Shackleton in a quiet voice. No more words were spoken. They grinned at each other in pure relief. Frank Worsley's navigation had been nothing short of flawless. Now, of course, the men were desperate to land. They had been without fresh water for nearly 48 hours. Every instinct screamed at them to get ashore. But as they drew closer, the reality of the coastline revealed itself. This side of South Georgia Island was brutally hostile. Reefs and jagged rocks lay everywhere, and massive ocean swells crashed into the shore with terrifying force. Shackleton took one look and knew the truth. They would never make it. The cruelty of the moment was almost unbearable. They could, in theory, reach land in 45 minutes, but they would die doing so. The boats would be smashed to pieces. So with fading light and no safe landing, Shackleton made an awful decision. He ordered the boat to turn away. They would have to endure another night at sea. And then, as if things were not already hard enough, fate delivered a final blow. A storm was coming, and it would be the worst they had ever faced. By nightfall, 60-foot waves were rolling in, driven by gale-force winds. 3 men worked the pump continuously throughout the entire night, while the others bailed water without rest. The boat was being forced downward into the sea, and this ordeal continued into the afternoon of the next day. They were exhausted beyond measure, delirious from thirst, and barely able to think. It felt as though the ocean itself was throwing one final test at them, as if to say, "So you think you've beaten me?" Rain turned to sleet. The wind screamed at hurricane strength. And if you think I'm exaggerating just for the story, you should know that during the same storm, just north of South Georgia, a 500-ton steamship was lost with all hands on board. So this was very much a deadly storm. And here they were, 6 men in a tiny open boat, clinging to life as the sea did its very best to take them. Frank Worsley stated that his biggest regret at the time was not that they were going to die, but how no one would know how far they'd come. Shackleton, who was usually the optimist, described the moment, writing, quote, "I think most of us had a feeling that the end was very near," end quote. When dawn finally came on May 10th, the wind had eased, but the sea was still angry. Shackleton set a course for a place called King Haakon Bay. The charts of the area they had possessed had been long ago ruined by water, so Frank Worsley guided the boat largely by instinct, reading the sea and the shape of the land. Eventually, they came upon a jagged reef guarding the entrance to the bay. All afternoon they tried to run through it, and each time they were driven back. The winds had shifted yet again and were now blowing straight out of the bay, directly working against them. They tried for hours, and then the light began to fade. The men were utterly desperate. They knew, without saying it, that they would not survive another night without fresh water. This had to be it. There would be no more chances. Shackleton ordered one final attempt. Every man worked the sails, drawing on whatever strength and seamanship they had left. They waited for the right moment, and then went. On the last attempt, they broke through. The oars were run out, and the men rowed with pure desperation. More reefs loomed ahead as they closed on a small rocky beach, but now all caution was gone. They drove straight on, accepting whatever came. At 5 o'clock on May 10th, 1916, Ernest Shackleton and his men jumped from the James Caird onto the shores of South Georgia Island, where they had first set off 522 days before. They had done it. Against every reasonable expectation, they were alive. And just so you know, historians consider this to be one of the greatest sea voyages ever undertaken by human beings. There is nothing more I need to say. Now, the first thing the men did was rush to a freshwater stream that was running down from a glacier above. They had never tasted anything better in all their lives. But there would be no rest, at least not yet. The men unloaded the last of their supplies and gear on shaky legs. They tried to drag the Caird up the beach, but they just didn't have the strength. They left her in the surf, tied down with a rope. It was discovered that the rudder had broken off while they had come ashore, but no one worried about that now. They staggered into a small cave on the side of a cliff and fell asleep. A one-man watch was set up throughout the night to look over the boat and ensure it wasn't pulled out to sea. And at 3 a.m, that's exactly what happened. The men awoke to Tom Crean up to his shoulders in the surf, shouting as he was holding the rope, trying to pull the Caird back to land. All hands were needed to bring her back. The men didn't even have the strength to turn the boat over, not with all the ballast in it, so Shackleton ordered that they would stand by until daylight. In the morning, the carpenter removed the decking, which made her light enough to be pulled further up the beach. Now it's time we check in and take stock of the situation. Let's remember that Shackleton found himself on the west side of South Georgia Island, and the whaling stations and help were all on the eastern side. Shackleton's original plan had been to sail the boat around to the other side of the island, which was a distance of around 130 miles. However, with the loss of the rudder, this would not be possible. And also, the men had witnessed how dangerous the coastline was. No one was keen to get back in the boat ever again. So, Shackleton came up with another plan, and to be honest, it was completely insane. Instead of sailing to the other side of the island, they would walk there. This was crazy for a few reasons. South Georgia Island is incredibly inhospitable and dangerous. The interior of the island, and where Shackleton would have to cross, consists of mountains rising over 10,000 feet high. The terrain is covered in glaciers and ice boulders, and the higher up in the mountains, the more dangerous the weather gets. Nobody, and I mean nobody, had ever crossed those mountains in all of human history. Most of the interior of the island was completely unexplored, simply because nobody had dared attempt it. Shackleton estimated the hike would be around 30 miles, which sounds a lot better than sailing around the island. But he had no route, and this would involve scaling mountain walls and carving a new path. But anyway, the decision had been made. They would cross the mountains. So over the next few days, the men rested and tried to recover some health. They managed to kill a few albatrosses, which at least gave them fresh meat. Harry McNish would write in his diary, quote, "We have not been so comfortable for the last 5 weeks," end quote. Meanwhile, Shackleton and Frank Worsley explored the area around their landing site and quickly realised there was no way out of the cove on foot. The cliffs and terrain hemmed them in completely. Around this time, the rudder of the James Caird washed up on the beach, which was a rare stroke of luck. The carpenter was able to repair it, restoring the boat to working order. But despite the return of the rudder, Shackleton did not change his plans to walk across the island. None of the men could face attempting to sail around the coast. However, Shackleton did decide on one short move by sea. They would sail just 6 miles to the head of King Haakon Bay, which offered a better starting point for the overland trek. The short journey was completed without incident, and once they were ashore on a broad, stony beach, the James Caird was hauled up and turned upside down to serve as a shelter. The men were relieved to spot large numbers of sea elephants nearby, so at least food would not be a problem. Now, Shackleton was keen to set off on the trek immediately, but the weather turned foul once again, forcing him to wait. Winter was tightening its grip on the island, and Shackleton knew that if they delayed too long, they might lose their chance altogether. The crossing would require clear skies and relatively mild conditions. Speed would be everything. For the journey across the mountains, Shackleton chose just 3 men: himself, Frank Worsley, and Tom Crean. If you're wondering about the other men, John Vincent was incapacitated by his rheumatism, and Harry McNish and Timothy McCarthy were also in poor physical condition. It was decided that McCarthy would stay behind to care for Vincent and McNish until rescue arrived. It's worth pausing here to understand just how unprepared Shackleton, Worsley and Crean were for what they were about to attempt. They had no mountaineering equipment and no maps. Their clothing was completely inadequate for the weather conditions. Shackleton decided they would travel as light as possible, without tents or sleeping bags. Once they started, there would be no stopping. Either they would reach the whaling station, or they would die trying. Each man carried 3 days' sledging rations. They took a stove and fuel, a small cooking pot, and matches. They carried 2 compasses, binoculars, 50 feet of rope, and a carpenter's axe. The only personal item permitted was Frank Worsley's diary. Shackleton left his shotgun behind, so the remaining men could hunt seals for food. Before they left, the carpenter pulled nails from the James Caird and hammered them through the soles of the men's boots to act as makeshift crampons. It was quite clever, and they worked remarkably well. So at dusk on May 18th, the weather finally showed signs of improving. That evening, Shackleton wrote a letter to McNish, formally placing him in charge of the others until help arrived. At the bottom he wrote, quote, "I trust to have you relieved in a few days," end quote. At 2 a.m. on May 19th, Shackleton, Frank Worsley and Tom Crean set out under a full moon. Harry McNish walked with them for the first 200 yards, then stopped, shook their hands and watched them disappear into the darkness. The 3 men quickly found the going difficult. The snow was a soft mush that sank over their ankles with every step. Progress was slow and exhausting. After 2 hours, they had climbed 1,000 feet and could see what lay ahead of them, nothing but jagged, fearsome mountains. As they continued their climb, a thick fog rolled in, reducing visibility of the moon. The men roped themselves together for safety. They continued for roughly 5 miles, when, looking down through a break in the mist, they spotted what appeared to be a frozen mountain lake. It looked like a natural route forward, and they began descending towards it. By this time, the sun was rising. However, after more than an hour of careful down climbing, the fog suddenly lifted, and they realized their mistake. It wasn't a frozen lake at all, it was a glacier, and beyond it lay the open sea. They had reached a dead end. There was no way to traverse the coastline from here, and no route across the ice. Valuable time and energy had been wasting chasing a false path. As disheartening as this was, they had no choice but to turn back and retrace their steps. It's worth remembering just how unforgiving South Georgia Island is. The island stretches over 100 miles in length, yet there are only a handful of places where a crossing is even possible. Choosing the wrong route wasn't just frustrating, it was potentially fatal. Every extra hour spent out in the open increased the chances of the weather turning, and with it, the risk that exhaustion or exposure would finally claim them. At 9 a.m, the men stopped for their first meal, sledging rations and seal meat. The day was clear and sunny, a rare gift, so they ate quickly and pushed on, eager to make the most out of the weather. At 11:15, they reached the summit of a mountain and were immediately confronted by a sheer 1,000-foot drop. There was no way down to the mountain pass below. To their right lay a tangled mass of ice and crevasses, which was impossible to cross. To their left, a line of glaciers plunged straight into the sea. Directly ahead, far below them, there was a gentle slope that stretched onward for what looked like around 8 miles, and that was exactly where they needed to be. But the problem was, there was no route down to it. It had taken them 3 exhausting hours to reach the summit, only to find themselves blocked in. They were forced to retreat and search for another way. And this pattern repeated itself again and again for the next few hours. Descend, look for a promising route, commit to it, only to find another dead end. It was painfully slow going. As they went, they were forced to take frequent breaks as they climbed and descended the mountains. It's easy to forget just how broken these men already were. For most of the previous 6 weeks, they had lived cramped inside a tiny boat. Their limbs were weak and unused to sustained exertion. Their feet, still damaged by frostbite, hurt with every step. And that's not even to mention the altitude. They had literally lived at sea level for nearly a year and a half. Now they were climbing as high as 5,000 feet. The sudden change made breathing harder and fatigue set in quickly. They found themselves stopping every 20 minutes, simply to recover. By 3 p.m, a heavy fog rolled in. Shackleton began to worry. They had made far less progress than he'd hoped, and darkness was approaching fast. Once night fell, they could not remain on the mountainside at this elevation. Temperatures would plunge below freezing, and their clothing was thin, soaked, and worn out. They would freeze to death. This meant one thing: they had to get down, and quickly. At 4 p.m, they reached the top of a ridge. Through breaks in the fog, they could just make out the terrain they needed to reach below. The slope was steep, but it looked possible, provided they cut steps in the snow and ice all the way down. They worked as fast as they could, hacking steps into the snow, but it was agonizingly slow. After 30 minutes of work, they had only covered 300 feet. There was 3 times that to go to the valley floor. Shackleton paused for a moment, deep in thought. At this rate, they would never make it, and it was too late to turn back. They were out of options, unless... He turned to face the others. "We've got to take a risk," said the boss. He explained that unless they got down now, they would freeze to death. At last he said, quote, "We'll slide," end quote. Crean and Worsley looked at him as if he was joking. Slide? But Shackleton wasn't joking, he was deadly serious. They voiced their concerns. What if we hit a rock? What if we slide off a cliff? But Shackleton's response was the same. We must get down the mountain at any cost. After a minute of deliberation, Worsley and Crean agreed. They were out of ideas. The men sat down, one behind the other, locking their legs around the man in front. They tied 3 knots in the rope they had, and each man sat on one, making it a kind of sledge. And then, before they had any more time to think, they pushed off into the darkness. Frank Worsley described the moment, saying, quote, "We seemed to shoot into space. For a moment, my hair stood fully on end. I yelled with excitement and found that Shackleton and Crean were yelling too." End quote. Faster and faster they went, rocks and ice blurring past them, their hearts thumping wildly. And then, in just a moment, they felt their speed lessen and they crashed into a snowbank. It had worked. They had descended around 1,000 feet in 30 seconds. The men looked at each other and laughed uncontrollably, shaking hands. They couldn't believe it. The only damage was to their clothes, which had been shredded. But there was no time to celebrate. Onwards they went. For 2 hours they kept at it, and by 5 a.m. they were once again making progress. By now, the men had been walking over the mountains for 26 hours, and they were exhausted. They found a sheltered spot to sit down for a moment, and huddled next to each other for warmth. Crean and Worsley were asleep in seconds. Shackleton felt himself drifting off, but fought to stay awake. All his years of experience in the Antarctic warned him against it. He had seen it before. A man falls asleep in the cold, and he never wakes up. He just freezes to death in his sleep. Shackleton stood for 5 minutes, and then woke the others. When they asked how long they'd been asleep, Shackleton told them half an hour in order to make them feel better. By 6 a.m, they reached the top of a ridge and got a glimpse of Stromness Bay. This is where the whaling station lay. There was just 12 miles to go. The men shook hands at the sight. Frank Worsley said, "It looks too good to be true." They continued to climb down the steep slopes and stopped for breakfast with the last of their food and fuel. Shackleton climbed a ridge to scout ahead and stopped in his tracks as he thought he heard a strange sound. After a minute of listening, he rushed back to the others and told them. Shackleton believed it was the sound of a whistle from the whaling station, waking the men. Then, a few minutes later, they heard another one. This was the first noise they had heard from outside humans in 17 months. Rescue was close. Rejuvenated by the sound, they abandoned the stove and continued on. But soon they had to make an important choice. They could hug the left side of the ridge, which was the safer option, but that would take them significantly longer. Or they could go straight ahead, a direct line down, which involved steep drops and serious risk, but it would cut hours from their journey. Shackleton didn't hesitate. He chose the faster, more dangerous route. Now normally the boss favoured caution where possible, but not this time. They were running out of energy. Nothing mattered more than getting down. It took them another 3 hours to make a tricky descent, cutting steps into the ice. From there was just one more climb, around 3,000 feet, which was now incredibly difficult for them. They staggered up the slope, willing each other on. Once they reached the top, they looked down the other side and saw it in all its glory, the whaling station. They could even see figures of men moving around below. For a minute, they stared without speaking. Then Shackleton said, "Let's go down." Now, being so close, Shackleton was determined to not make any mistakes and forced his exhausted brain to focus. One mistake now could still mean death. They followed a small stream for a while, but then it dropped away into a 20-foot waterfall. It was the only way down. The other sides of the waterfall were ice cliffs. It was the last obstacle between them and the station. They were too exhausted to think of anything else. They would have to go down. Before they could stop themselves, they secured the rope to a boulder and tied the other end around Tom Crean, lowering him over the edge. He got soaked by the freezing water, but made it down without incident. Shackleton went next, then Worsley, as he was the lightest. They had to abandon the rope as it was attached above, but they didn't care about that now. At 3 p.m, the 3 broken men staggered into the outskirts of the whaling station. They barely looked human at all. Their faces were blackened with blubber oil. Their hair was long, matted and wild. Their beards were thick and unkempt. Their clothes hung in tatters, shredded by ice and rock. They had crossed the mountains in 36 hours without rest. 2 children were playing outside the station. When they saw the figures emerging from the mountains, they screamed and ran away. A station foreman named Matthias Anderson looked up and froze. He could not believe what he was seeing. 3 wild men, blackened and broken, walking towards him like ghosts. What confused him most was where they had come from. No one came out of those mountains. Not ever. After a brief, stunned exchange, Anderson led them inside to the station manager named Turolf Surley, a man Shackleton had met before, all those months ago, when Endurance had first departed. Surley stared at the 3 men in disbelief and finally demanded, "Who the hell are you?" He did not recognize his old friend. Shackleton stepped forward and spoke quietly. "My name is Shackleton." At the sound of his voice, Surley's eyes widened. One account later said that he turned away at the sight of them and wept. They had done it. After the initial shock had worn off, Shackleton, Worsley and Crean were treated to hot baths, the first any of them had taken in over 2 years. They were given clean clothes and told to eat as much as they wanted. It's hard to even imagine the feeling of that first bath. Heaven is probably the closest description. After they had stuffed themselves with an enormous meal, Frank Worsley set out once again, this time aboard a whaling vessel, to sail around the other side of South Georgia and retrieve McNish, McCarthy and Vincent from the camp. Worsley slept through almost the entire 11-hour voyage. As he lay in his bunk, the weather outside turned violent. Listening to the storm batter the ship, Worsley wrote, quote, "Had we been crossing that night, nothing could have saved us," end quote. This is just another remarkable piece of luck. but the whalers on the island would later say that the day Shackleton, Worsley and Crean arrived at the station was the last day of good weather until the following spring. They had gotten extremely lucky. Worsley and the rescue party reached the camp the following day. We don't know much about the men's reactions to being rescued, except that at first they didn't recognise Worsley at all. Now he was clean shaven, washed and dressed in fresh clothes. He looked like a completely different man. The rescued men were brought back to the whaling station later that same day. I will note here though that the Norwegian whalers had the foresight to bring the James Caird with them. Even then, they understood that the little boat had accomplished something extraordinary and they wanted to preserve her. Meanwhile, while the 3 men were rescued, Shackleton was wasting no time. He immediately arranged the use of another vessel, the Southern Sky, to attempt the rescue of the men still stranded on Elephant Island. But before they departed, a kind of reception or celebration was thrown at the whaling station in their honour. The Norwegian whalers were hard men, some of which had spent 40 years sailing these treacherous seas. Shackleton described them by saying, quote, "Their faces were lined and seamed by the storms of half a century," end quote. No one else could better understand what an amazing feat Shackleton had pulled off. They were simply astounded. They wanted to shake the hand of the men who had accomplished the impossible. Of all the honours that followed, the respect of these whalers meant more to Shackleton, Crean and Worsley than anything else. I just want to add a quick side note here, as there is something else I found fascinating. When Shackleton later described the trek across the mountains of South Georgia, the journey seemed to almost take on a spiritual quality for him. This is interesting because Shackleton was not a particularly religious man, and yet he felt something strange. He wrote that during the crossing, it seemed as though there was a fourth presence with them, something watching over the group. Describing the experience, he wrote, quote, "When I look back at those days, I have no doubt that Providence guided us. During that long and racking march of 36 hours over the unnamed mountains and glaciers of South Georgia, it seemed to me often that we were 4, not 3, end quote. What makes this even more remarkable is that Shackleton was not alone in sensing it. Both Frank Worsley and Tom Crean independently reported the same feeling. At one point, Worsley even turned to Shackleton and said, quote, "Boss, I had a curious feeling on the march that there was another person with us," end quote. It's a strange and haunting detail, one that hints at the psychological extremes they were being pushed to. After reading this, I did some research and discovered that it's a well-documented phenomenon known as the third man factor. In extreme survival situations, people often report sensing a presence with them, someone walking beside them, watching over them, helping them endure. I plan on making a short video exploring this in more depth because it's something I found genuinely fascinating. Anyway, back to the story. The following morning, just 72 hours after finishing their trek, Shackleton, Crean and Worsley set out for Elephant Island. What followed was a brutal series of failed rescue attempts. The core problem was simple. Elephant Island was now surrounded with ice. Any ship that tried to reach it risked being trapped or crushed. The first attempt aboard the Southern Sky was forced to turn back just a week after setting out. The ice was too thick, and pressing on would have been suicide. The ship instead carried Shackleton to the Falkland Islands, where he was finally able to send a telegram to England announcing their survival. The news caused a sensation, and newspapers across the world ran stories of the incredible escape. Before the excitement, the situation was still very serious. Britain was still at war, and the government said it could not spare a ship for the rescue. For Shackleton, this was devastating. He would not and could not rest while his men remained stranded. His health began to suffer badly. The strain of everything he had endured, combined with the anxiety of the unfinished rescue, began to take its toll. His hair turned grey, and deep lines appeared in his face. He began to drink heavily, and Tom Crean at times had to step in and moderate his intake. The British Foreign Office reached out to the governments of Uruguay, Argentina, and Chile, searching desperately for a suitable vessel. But options were limited. Uruguay eventually provided a ship, but it managed only to get within sight of Elephant Island before being forced back by the ice. For Shackleton, it was maddening. Weeks slipped by, and then weeks became months. Every passing day meant the men could already be dead. He worried constantly about Frank Wild. I mean, how long would Wild hold the camp together before attempting his own desperate escape? Shackleton later admitted that this waiting drained him more than any storm, march, or frozen night he had endured. By now, 4 months had passed since the James Caird had left Elephant Island. In one final desperate effort, Shackleton appealed directly to the Chilean government. At last, they offered him a ship, a small tugboat named the Yelcho, which was crewed entirely by volunteers. The ship was completely unsuited to Antarctic ice, no reinforced hull, not even any heating, but it was all Shackleton had. And so, on August 25th, 1916, Shackleton once again set out for Elephant Island, this time aboard the Yelcho with Frank Worsley and Tom Crean at his side. It was the last chance to rescue the men that were still stranded. And with that, I'm going to return to the perspective of the men on Elephant Island. The last time we left them, Shackleton and the James Caird were disappearing into the horizon, leaving the others alone on a desolate beach with no way of knowing if help would ever come. Frank Wild had his job cut out for him. He was suddenly responsible for 21 exhausted, demoralised men with no proper shelter and very little food. The only fuel and nourishment available came from the penguins around them, and even that couldn't be relied on forever. Wild acted quickly. He made it clear that he was in charge, and he immediately put the men to work. Penguins were skinned for food and fuel, and attention turned to the most urgent problem of all: shelter. The beach they found themselves on was brutally exposed to wind and snow. If they were going to survive here for weeks, possibly months, they needed protection. The only materials available were the 2 remaining lifeboats. It was agreed they would be turned upside down and used as the roof of a makeshift hut. The men hauled rocks from the surrounding area and began building low stone walls as a foundation. It was back-breaking work. They were weak, underfed, and many were still recovering from frostbite and exhaustion. Eventually, 2 walls, roughly 4 feet high, were completed. The boats were dragged into place and laid across the top, sealing the structure off as best they could. It goes without saying that it was an incredibly tight fit with all 22 men inside. They were packed like sardines. That first night, a blizzard tore across the island. By morning, the men woke to find themselves buried under several inches of snow. The floors in their shelter had been exposed. The surgeon, Macklin, described the mood that morning, saying, quote, "I think I spent this morning the most unhappy in my life. All attempts seemed so hopeless, and fate seemed absolutely determined to thwart us. Men sat and cursed, not loudly, but with an intensity that showed their hatred of this island on which we had sought shelter." End quote. Despite this sentiment, things did slowly improve. Over time, the men reinforced the walls, sealed drafts, and learned how to live inside the cramped, dark space. On May 10th, Frank Hurley took this group photograph of the men standing outside their shelter. Later, he would describe it as, quote, "the most rough and unkept assembly of men ever photographed," end quote. Now, many of the men were still suffering badly from the ordeal of the boat journey, and the expedition surgeons, Macklin and McRoy, had their hands full. Lewis Rickinson was slowly recovering from his heart attack, and Greenstreet's feet were badly frostbitten, leaving him confined to his sleeping bag. Hubert Hudson was in a particularly serious state. He developed a painful abscess on his buttock that caused him constant agony. Mentally, he seemed broken, often lying in his sleeping bag for hours on end, silent and withdrawn. But the man in the most critical condition was Perce Blackborough. The toes on his left foot had turned gangrenous, and the surgeons watched him closely, knowing that any worsening could prove fatal. And so the days and then the weeks wore on. The men were struggling mentally more than anything else. It didn't help that the main topic of conversation was always the same: Shackleton. Over and over, they debated how long it would take him to reach South Georgia and how long after that it might be before a rescue ship arrived. But nobody dared say out loud what they were all thinking. What if Shackleton hadn't made it? What if he was at the bottom of the ocean? What if there was no rescue? Dozens of times a day, the men scanned the horizon, searching desperately for the outline of a ship. None ever appeared. In early June, it became clear that something had to be done about Perce Blackborough's feet. The gangrene had progressed too far. His toes would have to be amputated. The hut was transformed into a makeshift operating theatre. The stove was stoked to heat the space, and the surgeons cleaned their instruments as best they could. All the men who were able were sent outside, leaving only those who could not move. Chloroform was the only anaesthetic available. The operation took over an hour, but it was a success. The infected toes were removed, and Blackborough survived. Incredibly, he would recover. As June passed, winter fully set in. The ice around Elephant Island thickened. At times it would break apart briefly, raising their hopes, only to freeze solid again. June soon slipped into July, and then August. With each passing day, hope drained away. Surely Shackleton would have sent help by now. Greenstreet captured the mood perfectly, writing, quote, "Everyone spent the day rotting in their bags with blubber and tobacco smoke. So passes another goddamn rotten day." End quote. By August, the men began openly discussing the possibility that Shackleton had failed. With that thought hanging over them, plans were quietly drawn up for a last-ditch attempt to reach Deception Island using one of the boats. Everyone understood what this meant. It would almost certainly be suicide. They barely had one usable sail and only 5 oars, and they would be sailing straight into hostile winds and currents. It was an absolute last resort. Frank Wild still believed in Shackleton, but by now he was almost alone in thinking that the boss would rescue them. And that brings us to August 30th. It was just a normal day for the castaways. The men were gathered in the hut for lunch, which consisted of boiled seal backbone. The only man not present was Marston, the expedition's artist, who had gone outside to draw some sketches. A few minutes later, the men in the hut heard footsteps running from outside. Nobody thought much of it. Marston was just late for lunch. But he came into the hut and excitedly ran up to Frank Wild. In a whisper, he said, quote, "Wild, there's a ship. Shouldn't we light a fire?" End quote. It took a few seconds for those words to register, and then every person in the hut rushed for the door, in such a hurry that some didn't even make it through, and instead burst through the wall, leaving a hole. Outside, they were greeted by the sight of a small ship, about a mile away. Macklin ran up the nearest hill and tore off his jacket and tied it to an oar to wave as a flag. Frank Hurley set alight seagrass, blubber and paraffin, creating a small explosion. Meanwhile, Hudson and Ord Lees had carried Perce Blackborough outside so he could see the ship as he was still recovering from the amputation. Needless to say, the men were ecstatic with joy. They waved and shouted till their lungs hurt. Frank Wild wrote, quote, "I felt jolly near blubbing for a bit and could not speak for several minutes." End quote. The ship came as close as it could, and they watched as a small boat was deployed and headed their way. On it, they recognized the face of the boss, Shackleton. A cheer rose up, and the men laughed hysterically while others wept. When the boat got close enough, Shackleton yelled, "Are you all right?" And they yelled, "All well." Shackleton was relieved beyond words that everyone was accounted for. The men jumped into the boat, leaving everything in the hut. They just wanted to be gone. When they were all aboard the ship, they watched Elephant Island recede into the distance. Frank Worsley wrote in his diary, quote, "All well at last." End quote. And so at last, all the men had been rescued. Now I'm going to round things off by talking about the legacy of the expedition and discussing the fates of some of the characters in our story. But I just want to say, This really was a crazy adventure. I know it has been a long video, but I think it was worth telling in detail. I mean, the ship being crushed in the ice would make a good tale on its own, but then surviving on the pack, the boat journey to Elephant Island, the epic voyage of the James Caird, and then the final trek over the mountains. You really couldn't write a better action story. And it's remarkable that through all of this, not a single man of the expedition was killed or sustained a life-threatening injury. All 29 men returned to civilization. That doesn't often happen in the stories on my channel. Anyways, after being rescued, the men would be taken to Punta Arenas, Chile. The Yelcho radioed ahead, and the men were welcomed by hundreds of people on the docks, celebrating their return. Once ashore, the men gathered outside the Royal Hotel, and this photo was taken. It was proof that Shackleton had successfully rescued the men. He was immensely proud to have been the one to have done it. But despite the warmth of their reception in Chile, the rescue made relatively little impact beyond local headlines. Europe was still locked in the First World War, and millions had already been killed. When Shackleton and his men began to grasp the scale of the conflict, they were stunned. Compared to the industrial slaughter unfolding across Europe, their story of survival felt small. The world had moved on while they were gone. There were celebrations for a while, but nothing extravagant. Before long, the men drifted apart, returning to England or moving on with their lives. The expedition was officially over. So what then was its legacy? If we're being honest, the expedition itself was a failure. Its goal had been to cross Antarctica, and Shackleton never even set foot on the continent to begin that journey. But in hindsight, that was probably a good thing. The crossing of Antarctica would not be completed for another 40 years, and it is highly likely that Shackleton would not have survived such an attempt. Yet, despite the failure of the expedition, Shackleton's response to the dangers he faced and his ability to keep the men safe are today legendary. Now, many of the men were awarded the Polar Medal in recognition of their ordeal. When Shackleton finally returned to England in May 1917, his arrival passed almost unnoticed. There was no shortage of heroes in wartime Britain. And with that, I will talk about some of the men in our story and what happened to them. I feel like we spent a lot of time with them, so you deserve to know how their lives ended. Although I will keep this as brief as I can. What's crazy is that many of the men came back to England only to go off and fight in the war. Talk about having a hard life. For example, take Timothy McCarthy, one of the 6 men on the voyage of the James Caird. After the expedition, he returned home and signed up to serve in the war. Shortly after, he was killed when his ship was torpedoed and sunk. He was just 28 years old. Not an easy life at all. So what happened to Frank Hurley, the expedition's photographer? Well, Hurley went on to become one of the most influential photographers of the early 20th century. He documented World War I and World War II and continued to travel to remote places of the world. Some of his photographs of the world wars are stunning. He went on to live a full life until his death in 1962 at the age of 76. On the other hand, Harry McNish, the expedition's carpenter, had a far harder fate. There is no doubt that he played a hugely important role in the survival of the men, but often he caused trouble with Shackleton and some of the others. As a result, Shackleton did not nominate McNish for the Polar Medal, and many of the others thought this was unfair, as the carpenter had been indispensable. After the expedition, he struggled financially and suffered from poor health. He died in 1930, aged 52. Then there was Percy Blackborough. At just 19 years old, he wasn't even meant to be on the expedition. He had stowed away on the Endurance. I can only imagine how often he regretted that decision while stranded on Elephant Island. But anyway, after losing several toes to frostbite, Blackborough returned to a quiet life. He later served in the Royal Navy during the war, although avoided publicity and rarely spoke about the expedition. He died in 1949, aged 54. If you're wondering about Thomas Audley's, the quartermaster, well, upon returning to England, he would become a Marine in the Balloon Corps and learn to use parachutes. After the war, he moved to Japan, where he taught parachuting courses. He gained some minor fame for climbing Mount Fuji in 1922. He died at the age of 81. Now we come to some of the key members. Frank Worsley. Worsley was essential to the survival of the expedition, and his navigation on the James Caird was impeccable. Shackleton would not have done it without him. His feat of guiding the small lifeboat across the Southern Ocean using only a sextant and dead reckoning remains one of the greatest feats of navigation ever accomplished. And to make him more of a legend, after the expedition he served in World War I and received a Distinguished Service Order for bravery under fire. After the war, he took part in another adventure in the Arctic before returning to London to write books on his travels. He possessed a reasonably high profile due to his exploits, both with Shackleton and in the war, so he was able to give lectures to make a living. But at age 61, Worsley was not done with adventure. He actually went treasure hunting in the Pacific, south of Costa Rica, on an island where there was believed to be pirate treasure. And when World War II kicked off, do you think Worsley was going to miss that? Of course not. He still desired to serve his country. At the age of 67, he was too old to join the reserves, so eventually joined the Red Cross. He continually wrote to the War Office, offering his services for whatever was needed. But in 1942, he became unwell and was diagnosed with lung cancer. He chose to spend his last days with his wife and close friends. He died in early 1943 at the age of 70. His ashes were scattered on the River Thames. Next up, I want to talk about Tom Crean, one of my favourite members of the expedition, who was renowned for his resilience and strength. After returning to Britain, Crean was awarded his third polar medal. In 1920, he opened up a small pub in Ireland called the South Pole Inn. Shackleton offered him a place in an upcoming expedition, which I will get to shortly, but Crean turned it down to spend time with his wife and children. Throughout his life, Tom Crean was a very humble man. In the years after the expedition, he put his medals away and rarely spoke about his adventures. He lived happily with his family and pub until in 1938 he suffered a burst appendix. He was taken to hospital, but an infection developed and he died a few weeks later. He was 61 years old. In terms of his legacy, there are a number of geographical locations named after the explorer. This includes Mount Crean in Antarctica, another Mount Crean in Greenland, as well as Crean Glacier and Crean Lake on South Georgia Island. Finally, in 2003, this bronze statue of Crean holding his beloved pups was unveiled across from his pub in Ireland. And before we finish up by discussing Frank Wild and of course Shackleton, there are two small things I want to mention. Firstly, the fate of the extraordinary little boat, the James Caird. After Shackleton reached help and the 3 remaining men on South Georgia were rescued, the Norwegian whalers chose to recover the boat, recognising the incredible journey she had completed. Eventually, the Caird was transported back to England and put on display at Dulwich College in London. She also narrowly survived the bombing of the building she was kept in during the Second World War. In 1967, the boat was restored by the National Maritime Museum and returned to the college, where she remains to this day. I think it's so cool that this little lifeboat is still with us on display. Secondly, I have to mention the Endurance. For more than 100 years, the exact resting place of Endurance was lost to the world. There were attempts to locate the wreck in the 90s and early 2000s, but nobody had much luck. The ice in the Weddell Sea makes underwater exploration exceedingly difficult. However, in 2021, a new expedition was launched to find Endurance. The team consulted the logbooks written by Frank Worsley at the time in order to hone in on potential locations. And in March 2022, Endurance was found 107 years after she sank. Due to the coldness of the water, the ship is incredibly well preserved, and the team were able to capture these amazing photos. By the way, Worsley's calculations had been remarkably precise. More than 100 years later, they led us back to the ship at the heart of the story. So that brings us at last to Frank Wild and Shackleton. After returning to England, both men faced a world that had been transformed by war. The Endurance expedition felt like it belonged in a distant age. Shackleton was suffering from chest pain, and the stress and strain of the last few years was catching up with him. He was directionless, under financial stress, and drinking heavily. At the age of 42, he was too old to be conscripted, but nevertheless, he volunteered for the British Army. He repeatedly requested to be posted to the front in France, where the death rate was exceedingly high. However, he was denied. Since he had good relationships in South America, he was sent to try and convince Chile and Argentina to join the war on the Allied sides, but ultimately was unsuccessful. Frank Wild's story was very similar. He volunteered for duty and was made a temporary lieutenant. After the war, he went to South Africa and tried his hand at farming, but found it very difficult. The truth was, both men were lost. Shackleton resented normal life and was always looking for adventure. At home, he felt trapped. He returned to doing lectures briefly in 1917 and published his own book on the Endurance expedition titled South, but soon he got tired of doing lectures and searched for one final challenge. And so Shackleton turned to the one place he understood, Antarctica. He began planning one final expedition. To be honest, the objectives were vague. He spoke of sailing around the continent, investigating a few remote islands, but in truth, it felt as though he was simply searching for something to do. An old school friend agreed to finance the venture, and Shackleton acquired a small Norwegian ship, which he named the Quest. And who do you think was the first man Shackleton turned to? Of course, Frank Wild, who agreed to come along. By the way, some of the other men from Endurance signed up on this new expedition, despite having never received the correct wages. This shows how much they respected Shackleton and wanted to work for him. Among them was Alexander Macklin, the surgeon. From the outset, it was clear that Shackleton was unwell. When the expedition reached Rio de Janeiro, he suffered what was likely a heart attack. He refused a full medical examination, dismissing concerns and insisting that the journey continue. So Quest pressed south, reaching South Georgia on the 4th of January 1922. And well, in the early hours of the following morning, Shackleton summoned Macklin to his cabin, complaining of severe back pain. The doctor told Shackleton that perhaps he was pushing his body too far and should live a quiet life instead. Shackleton did not answer. A short time later, at 2:50 a.m. on the 5th of January 1922, Ernest Shackleton suffered a fatal heart attack while aboard the ship. He was just 47 years old. Frank Wild took command and completed the ship's journey. Plans were made to transport Shackleton's body back to England, but his wife, Emily Shackleton, instructed that his body should be buried in South Georgia. The surgeon, Macklin, agreed with this decision, writing in his diary, quote, "I think this is as the boss would have had it himself, standing lonely on an island far from civilization, surrounded by a stormy, tempestuous sea, and in the vicinity of one of his greatest exploits." End quote. Something I just want to add here is that years later, when Frank Wild died, he was cremated in Johannesburg, South Africa. However, in the early 2000s, an author named Angie Butler was researching a book about Wild when she discovered his ashes were still in a vault in the Johannesburg cemetery. Wild's relatives agreed that the ashes should be moved to South Georgia Island beside Shackleton's grave. The author, Angie Butler, later said, quote, "His ashes will now be where they were always supposed to be. It just took a long time getting there." End quote. So there we have it. Shackleton's adventures were over. Personally, I think it's hard not to like the old boss. He wasn't perfect, but he gave his all in every situation and cared deeply for his men. In fact, this story is largely what inspired me to make these videos in the first place. I don't talk about myself on this channel, but I was going through a difficult time in my life, and this story gave me perspective on what's possible to endure when everything feels hopeless. I hope that maybe it can do the same for you. I will leave you with this famous quote that compares Shackleton with other explorers. I think it sums everything up well. Quote, For scientific leadership, give me Scott. For swift and efficient travel, Amundsen. But when you're in a hopeless situation, when there seems no way out, get down on your knees and pray for Shackleton." End quote.